Hello everyone, this is Lala, and today I'm concluding my year-long coverage of Big Brother Canada, which ultimately culminates into this video, which is me ranking the Big Brother Canada seasons. So the timestamps for the seasons and other stuff will be down below, as well as the link to my social media will be down below as well. And I'm going to base this off of the 7 categories that I used to create my other videos. So I talked about the pre-jury, jury, endgame, the cast, the twists, the drama, and the gameplay. So I discussed those in 7 different videos, and I'm going to use the numbers that I gave each season to add up and divide into a median, and based on that median will be the score that I use to rank the Big Brother Canada seasons. I will also make a note on where I initially had the season rankings after I finished watching the seasons last year, and seeing how that changed from that list to me breaking each season down by the 7 categories and the median that I am using to rank this overall. So that is how I'm formulating this video, and let's just get right to it. So dead last, which is 10th place, goes to Big Brother Canada 7. So after I initially watched the seasons last year, I did have the season as last, and after picking out the 7 categories, that didn't change. And it's really not shocking. When you look at the cast, there really are not many notable people on it. Of course, there are the pretty boys who pretty much dominated the season. Mark did the least on the season as a player out of the bunch, and was not interesting as a character at all on his own, as he came off as creepy more than anything. Dane is a very good player and really dominated the season, but as a character and personality, he didn't really offer a whole lot, and it's kind of forgettable compared to the other 2 pretty boys that I haven't discussed yet. Adam and Anthony are the only 2 ones who had a great mix of gameplay and dynamic personalities, which is why I think those 2 are the ones that are hugely remembered and talked about today, 5 years later. Samantha was the only woman who was interesting, as she had a dynamic personality, and she had an interesting journey throughout the season, where her showmance with Adam caused a lot of drama as well. Outside of them, I think everyone else is a complete dud in the season. A lot of the pre-jurors are painfully forgettable, like Laura, Eddie, Kiara, and even some of the jurors are forgettable, like Corey, Estefania, and Damien. Kyra was the first non-binary person to ever be a part of Big Brother, but they were just very cringe and uncomfortable to watch, where their contribution was kind of a negative. Mackie, Kaylin, and Chelsea could have potentially been interesting had they lasted longer, but they're easy to forget once you're not watching the show, and they weren't cut very soon, so I can't even be too highly on them, even though they aren't on par with the duds that I've mentioned in the pre-jury and the jury, were the people who made it to those 2 portions of the season. In general, this cast just really did not mesh well together, and it says a lot that over half of the cast is painfully forgettable. A part of me was going to put this a bit higher, since it does have the pretty boys, which is one of the strongest alliances in Big Brother history, not just Canada, but I really cannot ignore the rest of the cast, and due to that, I really wanted to put the season as dead last pertaining this category. But clearly, I decided not to do that. Adam had a preseason plan of making a 4-member guys alliance to pretty much replicate the brigade from Big Brother 12, and he executed it on the first day by recruiting Dane, Anthony, and Mark into the alliance, and winning the first HOH. They were of course able to pick everyone else off throughout the season, but there are more intricacies that I have to talk about. Dane pretty much had Estefania, Damien, and Kiara as numbers. Adam had Samantha, Chelsea, and Kyra, the latter later on, and Anthony had Corey as his number, though he had decent relationships with a lot of people in the house. The first half of the season was pretty much everyone against Samantha and somewhat Adam, or at least according to the people who weren't in the Pretty Boys alliance, and it was really irritating seeing the women refuse to even attempt to see that there was a guys alliance, hence all the women going home early and them just ignoring that facet, letting stupid pettiness make this season boring as hell. Even when the pretty boys started infighting, especially throughout the second half of the season, you can never get invested because nothing was going to change gameplay wise. So when Adam used his power to send Corey home, despite Anthony outplaying Dane and Anthony by getting Mark to do what he wanted, it really didn't leave much intrigue. And stuff like that, you just really didn't care much for. And the other house guests that were not in the alliance but made it past the halfway point, like a Corey, Kira, Estefania, or Damien, didn't even really care to play the game and were beyond clueless, which just made the season even worse on this front. There was no power shift, there was no intrigue throughout the season, even when the final five causes the pretty boys to turn on one another. The stakes just didn't matter to me at that point, despite it being one of the more interesting weeks of the season, gameplay wise, since Dane was able to convince Anthony to keep him when Anthony should have booted him. And the other castmates are too strategically inept for me to even care or consider putting this cast higher in this category. There really was not much drama in the beginning of the season, but the one moment that I do remember in the beginning was Mackie cursing the house with a plague after he is blindsided, with Kira and Kaylin going at it in the aftermath, though it was still more tame in comparison to most of the drama in other seasons. A lot of the so-called drama in the beginning of the season involved Samantha and a lot of arguments involving herself and Adam, which is a precursor pertaining their eventual breakup in real life. And while a lot of the house guests did not like her, they never really stepped to her in any argument, which made it very boring. The jury portion of the season was mainly the pretty boys arguing with one another, and it was mainly Adam and Anthony going at one another, since they both had the most alpha personalities and had the most differing motivations compared to everyone else in the group. I do remember Adam and Mark going at it a few times during the season as well, but Mark was mainly just dismissed. The final five round was very dramatic, and we saw a lot of tension due to it, where it really is a good week, due to the pretty boys being forced to have to turn on one another, and it was the one week that actually had some sort of stakes in it. Kyra got into a few arguments, like the moment with Anthony later on in the season, where Anthony sitting down speaking to her because he knew he would come off as intimidating if he stood above her or sat above her. And their drama, meaning Kira's drama, with Chelsea was more cringeworthy. While there were some decent moments in the season drama-wise, none of it really had any sort of stakes, since the pretty boys were always going to stay loyal to one another no matter what, and none of it really mattered, especially with it being so set in stone, and when most of the cast are just complete deads who aren't contributing to anything, including the drama, it's no shock that the season is this low in this category. There were more twists in the season than I remembered, but because of what happened in the season, I can see how it's very easy to forget since things were so stale from the very beginning. There was a twist where you can vote someone into the secret room to observe the house guests, and nothing came up of it from watching Damien watch what would have been the formation of the pretty boys, and I believe he also had another opportunity to go into the room to watch whatever else was going on, but of course because it's him, nothing came of it. This season is the final time where someone is voted into the house by the audience and enters slate, where we have Corey enter the house, but she didn't contribute much to the season and no one really cared. Thankfully, they ended this. What was supposed to be a major twist was the blood power of veto, where you could use it after the eviction takes place, and it would cause the other person on the block to be evicted. But Kira did not use it, despite knowing about the Pretty Boys Alliance or the Op Boys Alliance, so this ended up being a huge dud, and just another missed opportunity with the season. Also, this is the very first season where only 5 players would partake in the veto competition, and they did this by making the HOH not eligible to play in the veto competition, and they clearly did this so there would be a higher chance of the veto being used, giving the nominees better odds, and this changes how the show went on. And it helped the show, though I don't think it helped it as much as many fans claim it did, but it wasn't a negative, and it was a somewhat slight positive. From my recollection, the final twist of the season is the secret assassin twist, where you find a power in a box, which is in the archive room, and name a third nominee after the veto ceremony takes place. Adam ends up winning the power, and is able to get revenge on Corey for sending Samantha home, and it caused Anthony to spiral, since it was the first time that he did not have any control, and things went in the opposite of the way he wanted it to go, which was kind of fun to watch. While a lot of the season sucked, I don't think the twists were the worst element of the season, and it isn't any worse than the twist in many seasons in general, hence it being here. There was absolutely no other choice but to put the season as dead last, despite it having only one good week. The first week was pretty boring, but that tends to be the case with Big Brother Canada. But there's also no veto during this week, which was lame, and Laura was such an easy person to send home, since she was talking a lot about HOH Adam and his girlfriend, Samantha. We move on to the only interesting week of the season, where Dane wins HOH, who continues the control of the Pretty Boys, which consists of Anthony, Mark, Adam, and Dane. Kira was going to be the target, and they end up whining and complaining, but Mackie dug a hole for himself after Adam stopped the Samantha back door. And it was entertaining seeing this split vote and how the Pretty Boys pulled off sending Mackie home without exposing their alliance. Things quickly got boring again when Chelsea won HOH and wasted it on Kaylin of all people, and nothing interesting at all happened during the week. She ignored all the signs of a guy's alliance, as well as Samantha and Kira, and she didn't realize why she got had in the following week, once Dane nominated her and had to deal with the uncomfortableness of Kira. The person who has been targeted the entire season in Samantha finally wins HO8, and she's willing to make a huge move. But she has Adam negatively influencing her to make a move against her best interest, which she seems to be aware of, but ends up giving up by targeting Kiara, who goes home unceremoniously, despite there being a twist introduced that Kira could have used to save their and Samantha's game. Out of 1 week, the pre-jury was in utter borefest, and the high of this pre-jury doesn't match the highs on any other season. This was a very easy spot for last. We start the jury phase with Corey winning HOH, and she's wondering about who attempted to backdoor her last week. The entire house, pretty much sans Adam and Kira, set up Samantha, and while we did get Adam spiraling, especially against the Alliance for a bit, it was essentially all his own doing, as there's not a whole lot of drama from what I could remember, and the bit that was there ultimately didn't matter much. The next week involved Mark winning HOH, and I believe he was attempting to target Damien or Estefania, but I don't really care to figure it out at this point. Adam won his secret power and was able to get Corey on the block, despite Anthony convincing Mark not to put her up, and she easily went home. The final week of this portion of the season involved Adam winning HOH and boringly sending Estefania home, with no intrigue of anything taking place. Just like the pre-jury, there was nothing happening at this point, and the low squabbles between the Pretty Boys meant nothing, since the same boring dynamic would stay the same no matter what. OMG, a category that BBCAN 7 is not low on, and it really isn't shocking, but it happened by luck. The endgame started just as boringly as all the other parts of the season started, as Dane nominates two of the remaining non-Pretty Boys to send Damien home in the double. Kira ends up winning the next HOH, and no one expected that to happen, as it forces the Pretty Boys to target one another around early. Everyone is essentially against Adam at this point, and he snaps when Kira nominates him, and Adam really shows his butt here, and Anthony ends up going at it with Adam, though Adam ends up crying in Anthony's arms, and they all have a nice kumbaya moment. Adam saves himself with the veto, and Dane is the replacement nominee, where it seems like Dane is a for sure goner at this point. Dane manages to pull some magic, and despite being the biggest threat, he ends up staying over the weak liability in Mark. Dane wins the following HOH and targets Adam, who thinks that the Pretty Boys will go to the end together, and he has a crying meltdown once they tell him that he's getting the boot. Honestly, it's really only this high due to the final 5 round and seeing Adam's karma, but it's one of the only somewhat interesting elements of the season, and of course Dane ends up beating Anthony at the end, and Kira is obviously the third placer that they were meant to be the entire season. At 9th is Big Brother Canada 11, which has the score of 7.43, which is about 0.9 scores higher than BBCAN 7, which had 8.29 points. My initial thought of the season after rewatching all the seasons was that I did have it at 9th, and it unfortunately didn't change based on going through the 7 categories in more thorough detail pertaining to cast. So I don't know whether this cast is closer to being the worst one over BBCAN 7, but it's very close, and I could easily have an argument for placing this as last. The BBCAN 7 cast had live feeds to help them, but at the same time, they had live feeds and were still boring as fuck. but BBCAN 11 didn't have live feeds and seemingly were a bit more interesting from what we saw on the episodes. On one end, it caused us to not know the cast and to get really attached to them, but at the same time, we saw on the edit that their more interesting moments were put on the show, and they probably had more interesting moments that didn't make it on the show, but would have been on the feeds. So, easily, the strongest casting choice of the season is Kuzi, who offered a lot pertaining to the gameplay, drama, personality, narration, and the spirit of the season, as well as Santina, where there is no one like her that's ever been cast, and chaos follows her everywhere she went, while having a very interesting arc. Ty and Zach aren't likable people, but they offered a lot when it came to the gameplay and drama of the season. A lot of the cast are extremely forgettable though. Pre-jurors like Amal, John, Michael, Roberto, and Vanessa really don't offer much to the season, and you will forget about them in the blink of an eye. Though they potentially had more personality than what we saw of them, especially with Amal and Vanessa. Even jurors like Dan, Jonathan, Shania, and Anika don't offer much to the show or the game, though they probably would have benefited from live feeds, since people in their archetypes usually are a bit more liked based on what we see on the live feeds, or at least Jonathan, Shania, and Anika would have. Dan, I can't really say that at all. Claudia herself isn't really memorable, but it's her showmance is what causes her to be a bit more memorable, though she herself wasn't interesting. And Renee could have been a favorite kooky mess, but there were no live feeds, and she was easily overshadowed by people like Kuzi and Santina in that regard. Daniel played a solid game, but had some personality as well. But in general, he's just someone who generally would benefit from the feeds, since he was not the most prominent on the edit, and we would have understood the intricacies of his game a lot more, and I don't think they showed a whole lot of his personality on the episodes. In general, there really isn't anything else to say, and while the dynamics could have been interesting, the lack of attachment to them is a huge problem, especially with some of them not having much shown on it. With this category, it is definitely harder to choose, since some would say that a season with one alliance dominating is better gameplay, even if the rest of the cast isn't doing anything, while others would disagree. Some would say that a season where there is no dominating alliance is a better or a worse season pertaining gameplay for whatever reason that they deem fit. I have Big Brother Canada 11 the lowest when it comes to gameplay, due to me thinking that it encompasses the worst of all types of gameplay. Whether it's just someone just competing out, or a bunch of people not knowing what the F they're doing, or there not being much dynamicism in general. So there was a boys alliance that seemed like it was going to run things for a while, but due to jealousy, mainly Ty, making dumb decisions and the need to be in control, mainly Zach, but also Ty as well, that alliance falls apart. The Girly Pops alliance was a thing from the beginning, and people underestimated them, which is why they were left alone for a while, and I believe they're the most successful girls alliance in North American Big Brother history. And the crown was formed around the time Zach was booted, which consisted of people like Kuzi, Anika, Daniel, those three were already in an alliance, Jonathan and Hope, who were kind of left in their own island after the Boys Alliance blew up. Ty and Zach really declared the games and Roberta went home. So that's how the crown was formed. So that alliance was seemingly winning things for the next few weeks, but they kept on making dumb decision after dumb decision, which all came back to bite them once the Leonard Ty and the Girly Pops, which consisted of Renee, Claudia, and Shania, started winning a lot of those later competitions. Of course, there was a point in the season around the last third of the season where nothing really mattered, as Ty kept on winning damn near every competition, and the other Huskists ended up cowering in fear due to his competition wins, which led to him steamrolling the rest of the season. So we end up with this steamroll set by competition wins and a bunch of alliances who make poor choices, which border on frustrating instead of entertaining more times than not. And it also doesn't help that we didn't have feeds to get extra context as to what was happening, as the digital dailies didn't tell us too much And from what the cast stated afterwards, I don't think we missed too much pertaining their commentary post-season about the season and things that we missed. With this being a season that is commonly low rated, I was not expecting this season to rank this high in the drama department. We really see Ty and Zach cause havoc with their reign and overconfidence, which started pissing people off. Vanessa ended up arguing with the both of them during her shirt period in the house. The drama of the boys' alliance going downhill was pretty funny, especially with how overdramatic Jonathan was. And then we, of course, have the third week where Ty and Zach tried to get Hope expelled, since Hope used the veto on himself, causing Zach to go up. And the three of them went at it, and it led to a bunch of Huskies just yelling at the two men, and them yelling back at others, though we mainly have Kuzi and even Anika getting into it with the two of them. Damn near everyone in the house ended up yelling at Santina the next week, since she poorly hid the fact that she was the invisible HOH, and we shockingly heard from the mute Dan, which was interesting to say the least. And I also remember it was around this time where Santina and Anika were also arguing about poorly made waffles, which is such a what the fuck thing to do. But it's memorable. Seeing how the house treated Shania just because she used the veto to save Renee, I believe it was Renee, and Jonathan going up was so fucking ridiculous, and there was some drama with that as well. Oh, I also forgot that the girly pops were locked out of the secret room during the twist. What was the twist? It was, I guess, it was pretty much the chain twist. That twist, so that was pretty interesting as well. In general, Ty was just a walking drama queen with how he spoke to everyone throughout the entire season, and created fights everywhere he went, even if he was extremely unlikable. We had the destruction of the Crown Alliance, and we saw Kuzin losing her position with Daniel and Anika, where she argued with them a lot during her last 2 weeks in the house, even getting into it with Daniel right before her eviction started. It's really a shame that defeats were not a thing this season, since I'm sure there was a lot more drama that we missed, but this cast did deliver in this component. I don't know how memorable these fights will be in the future, which is why it's only at 4. I'm all over the place with the twist of the season, where I am more negative on some seasons, and I'm more positive on other seasons regarding the twist, hence this being roughly around the middle. The first twist of the season, from what is listed on the wiki, is that they extended the first week, where the first week is now really 2 weeks, and BBCAN and BBUS switched with how they handled their first weeks, as currently BBUS's first week is now only 1 week, where that wasn't the case in the last 2 decades, where it was really 2 decades. And for the last decade, BBCAN had their first week really only be 1 week. So it really caused us to see more of this cast, especially the first boot and the dynamics during the first week, where we honestly got nothing of them and the dynamics in the first week in general during the last 10 seasons before this. There was a last place twist to be a nominee in the first week, and it sucked a lot of ass, but thankfully it didn't last longer than a week. There was a Wendy's points twist throughout the season where everyone in the cast has a certain amount of points, and when someone is evicted, they have to give their points to someone else in the house. I liked this, but what those points led up to at the auction during the second to last week, if I remember correctly, was very disappointed. But I get it because it is the endgame, and they didn't want to do something that's too altering. There was the Fatal Feast twist, where they did use the chain of safety from last season, and the feast was clearly inspired by the Traders, and it was very interesting with how they implemented this into a double eviction, where it was the way they did it in BB5 to BB7, damn near 2 decades ago, where one eviction is earlier in a week and the second eviction is at the end of the week, where a normal eviction always takes place. The Invisible HOH returned this season as well, and it was very explosive compared to BBCAN 9. And what I like about it is that the veto window also had to be kept a secret as well. Yes, it was this season that I was debating about whether to switch it with Big Brother Canada 4 or not, but I ultimately chose to rank this higher. The thing with this pre-jury is that it's 3 weeks of gameplay, but because week 1 is really 2 weeks, it makes the pre-jury 4 weeks, making it tied with Big Brother Canada 3 as the shortest pre-jury period in Big Brother Canada history. Week 1 in general was very boring, since Santina ended up being a pick-me for the Guys Alliance, as she decided to target Shawn Michael, who she promised would be safe, since they did the HOH competition and the other competition together, and he wanted to work with her. And it really didn't lead to any drama, and the fact that it's really half of the pre-jury tanked it down quite a bit. Ultimately, the next 2 weeks really pushed this season higher on this category. The big target in Dan ends up winning HOH, and Zach is convinced by Ty to destroy the all-male alliance by booting Roberto, and the fallout of that move was a lot more explosive than I and other people were expecting, though it did start the downfall of Zach. Kuzi ends up winning the next HOH in the final pre-jury week and wanted to make a huge move, as she did not like how Zach and Ty were playing the game, but thought targeting Santina was a good idea, and also Vanessa was also causing some fights here and there during the last week or so. Of course, there was Lettergate that really was a month in the making, and is one of the weirdest and most unique things I have ever seen in Big Brother history, not just Canada, but US as well. But it led to a huge fight after Ty and Zach failed to gaslight Hope for protecting himself, and when they could not get Hope expelled. Zach quit because he knew he was getting voted out, was the culmination of this. A lot of good stuff here, but the first half of the pre-jury is just boring, and overall, it isn't as great as the others above it, but it makes for a great halfway point. Honestly, this is very effing hard trying to figure out this list, since most of the rest of the seasons up to this point have good points during each of their early jury portions. Due to all the DQs, the jury starts really early this season, with Santina winning the Invisible HOH only for the entire house to figure it out, and everyone spazzing out, with Renee's meltdown and most of the house yelling at Santina, who didn't take it out without a fight either, as she defended herself as well. Though this would be the start of Ty steamrolling, since Daniel ended up using the veto on him when he could have went home this week had Daniel not done that. We then have the next week where Ty wins HOH and Hope decides to nominate himself as a pawn for some reason, which started the downfall of the Crown Alliance, as he was the pawn against Renee. Shania wins the veto, takes Renee off, which causes damn near the entire house to freak out, since Jonathan was nominated and sent home that week. Ultimately, things fall off a cliff once Kuzi's HOH turns into a chain of safety, causing Santina to go home. Claudia wins the next HOH, nominates a showman, who ends up winning the veto, and Hope goes home. Kuzi feels like alone in her alliance, and there's some infighting between herself, Daniel, and Anika, with Kuzi being unceremoniously sent home on Renee's HOH. There were some good moments in the early drawing portion, but it's just weaker than many of the others, and the steamroll is just a bit too much. This choice was very easy, and it's not because it's the freshest in my mind, or because it's the most recent. The endgame of the season starts with the double eviction, where Claudia wins HOH and decides to not nominate her showmans, as she nominates Daniel and Anika for eviction. Expecting Ty to not use the veto when he has been selfish gameplay-wise the entire season wasn't very smart, since he takes Anika off the block and sends Shania home, which causes the girly pops to cry their eyes off. Anika wins HOH and nominates Claudia and Renee, hoping that Ty won't do the same thing that he did with his own showmans in the double, since they all expected him to win the veto at this point. And of course, he does the exact same thing and Renee ends up going home, so Claudia only has him as an ally. The showmans dominates after this, and Ty easily steamrolls Claudia in the final vote. And it doesn't even matter about Anika and Daniel going home and what order they went home in. In general, there really was nothing enjoyable about the season at this point regarding the endgame, since it's a clear steamroll, everyone is playing around his comp wins, and the entertaining element of the season has long since passed by the point that the endgame takes place. So at 8th, I have the OG season in Big Brother Canada 1, which also has the same score as BBCAN 11, with both of them having a score of 7.43, but ultimately I'm putting BBCAN 1 higher, just simply because I like it more, and based off of my first rankings right after watching all of the seasons last year, I had it at 6th, so that is why I have it here. And I just have more positive memories of this season compared to BBCAN 11, so that's kind of what broke the tiebreaker. The one that started it all. So yes, I was debating about whether to put this season and Big Brother Canada 3 in the opposite positions. So I have a very interesting relationship with this cast. underpinning my viewing journey. When the series first started, I thought it was a very strong cast, and many of them contributed to the season. But with the show continuing on through many seasons, and this season being over a decade old at this point, I don't really feel the same anymore. Kat and Danielle didn't get much to do on their short times on the season, while Anil and Liza were definitely gamers and seemed a bit messy. Nothing really came to fruition, and they became somewhat forgettable, at least for their in-game antics and for how they were on the actual edit. Tom was a notable pre-Jorah villain in BBCAN, so I can't say he was a dud at all, as he pretty much offered what everyone expected that he was going to offer. Suzette had a few moments during the season and is very unique, but even she got boring after a while. AJ was a dud who contributed absolutely nothing during the season, and I didn't find him funny whatsoever. Topaz had a lot of moments that are still very memorable today, and she is definitely an iconic player. The Shield were very infuriating and irritating, but I would be lying if I said that they didn't contribute a lot to the season, even if it was negative and dated, so they unfortunately were not duds. Andrew was decent and had his moments in the season, so while he isn't a dud, he's very forgettable in the grand scheme of things. So he's kind of similar to Joel from BBCAN 4 in that element. Tala was great comic relief, especially during the second half of the season, though it's easy to see why her successes are more remembered now. Emmett is definitely the attractive gamebot who dominated the season, but he is more arrogant, dramatic, and hot-headed than I remembered compared to the first time I watched the season, so I can't even really say that he's a dud. And Jillian definitely had her fiery moments throughout the season, though nothing compared to the Amazing Race, but even she pales in comparison to some of her cast members. What do I even really need to say about Gary? He was the star of Big Brother Canada for several years, and he's still one of the most remembered people from the season or the series overall. But he brought competition, drama, personality, and there's still absolutely no one like him. Overall, the cast had some great casting choices, some duds, and some forgettable people, even if they themselves were not duds. Though the dynamics weren't the strongest, which I have to admit now, so it is a mixed bag. And I also think I thought the season's cast was much stronger at the time because it was sandwiched between a lot of not great Big Brother US seasons and casts, so it definitely came off as positive compared to then. But once I'm solely comparing it to the other BBCAN seasons, the cast definitely lacks in comparison. A part of me was thinking about putting the season quite a bit higher pertaining to the gameplay of the season, but when you really get to the core of it, the season was a steamroll from the very beginning to the very end, and there really isn't much to talk about when it comes to the gameplay. There was the Quattro Alliance that was seemingly running things for the first few weeks of the season, as Emmett, Tom, Alec, and Peter seemingly had a lot of control and power throughout the house, as they had a lot of power, and two or three of them at least had a lot of relationships to have their influence spread. And I'm not included Tom in those three. Ultimately, Tom became too much of a liability, so the house turned on him, and this gave Emmett a chance to pivot into working with what would become the East Coast Alliance with Jillian, Andrew, and Tala. They dominated the rest of the season, and what's even more frustrating is that Peter and Alec had many opportunities to create a path for themselves to have true agency, with people like Topaz, Gary, AJ, and I'm pretty sure a few others, and they completely blew it since they were so obsessed with Emmett's approval. And they ignored a lot of Topaz and even Gary's advice, especially when it was good advice that they very much needed to follow. And what makes it even worse is that Gary came back into the end game, almost won the season, and then Jillian won due to an accidental vote. Gameplay wise, the season is just a complete bore fest, and the fact that this section is a lot shorter than the other seasons just shows that there's not much to the season gameplay wise, and it's warranted in me putting it this low. And I feel like people forget a lot about the season in general, though I don't think many people thought it was forgettable earlier on in this country's show's history. Due to this, I do think people forget a lot about the drama that did happen in the season. Strategically, there wasn't a whole lot of drama in the beginning of the season, and the bit that we did get had nothing to do with strategy. I remember Jillian and Danielle just talked about one another, but it didn't actually lead to anything. Tom got into his fair share of drama during the short time that he was in the house, as he argued with Tala over alcohol, which was just so stupid, his petty feud with Suzette during the third week, where he gave her an awful nomination speech and she calls him a redneck during the veto competition, and Des Topaz ended up ripping him apart because he opened the shower door when Alec was in it, and obviously there are live feeders in the cameras that are still in the washroom. And apparently they edited some of that out as well, with Topaz going in on Liza. Suzette had her huge freakout on Anil during the third week, and managed to even argue with Emmett on her way out of the season, as he gave her a pretty harsh veto speech, and she did not handle it well at all. Tala caused a lot of drama during the second half of the season, and I remember Gary and Topaz ripping into one another. Actually, no. I remember Gary and Topaz ripping into Tala within the time span of like a day or two, as Gary got in her face over some Heflot drama, and Topaz thought that Tala was hooking up with Alec, though she did defend herself well during those arguments. I think the most gameplay-oriented fights throughout the season happened closer to the end with Tala and Andrew, where he felt like she should be nominated because she did nothing in the game and he's sick of his entitled quote-unquote deserves it attitude, where they argued so much during the latter weeks, adding a little excitement to the endgame, which was pretty boring and set in place. I also remember Emmett pissing off Andrew because his ass got caught cheating in the veto competition. In general, there are a decent amount of fights in the season, but they are not the most notable and didn't amount to a whole lot in the season in general, especially compared to the other season. I'm trying to go over all the twists that happened in the season. I guess the first HOH competition being determined by a phone is one of them, and it was kind of lame to be honest, but not the worst thing ever. There was Canada's veto, which forced it to be used at the eviction ceremony, and I didn't like it because Suzette was running out of fumes and was checked out anyways, while we lost Anil, who could have done some serious damage in the season as his game was starting to recover, and he was one of the few people who were completely on to Emmett. The instant eviction seemed interesting at first, since no one could speak to one another and the eviction is very quick, but the execution is not the best, since the house guests were able to overhear Topaz and it kind of ruined any chance of a split house. But as a twist itself, it's pretty decent. And of course, the worst twist in my opinion was the returnee twist, and Summer returning isn't really what bothered me at all. It was when they did it, which they chose to do it at the Final Four, then turning into the Final Five, when there were 2 weeks left of the game. And then it was decided by a Canada's vote, not even a competition or by the House guests voting, but Canada voting. And it might have been a plan from the beginning for BBCAN, but a part of me was, and someone is kind of skeptical, since it seemed like it was something specifically set up to get Gary to come back into the house, since the others were not fan favorites. And the fact that he almost won, and if it wasn't for Topaz being Topaz, he would have won the season, definitely brings this down a lot more, in my opinion. While the twists in BBCAN 1 are not the worst, barely any of them paid off in a positive way. So that is why it is here. Especially because we didn't even get any entertainment from a lot of the twists that were put on the season anyway, so it's kind of just lackadaisical, which is kind of unfortunate for the first season. I don't recall there being a whole lot happening with this pre-jury. The first week involved Suzette being the first to pick up the phone, hence her becoming HOH, and she immediately nominated Tom and Emmett, which I believe happened on the first day, as well as the veto competition that Tom won, where a cat was unceremoniously sent home after Tom saved himself. The Quattro alliance between the four guys of Emmett, Tom, Alec, and Peter had a lot of power during this early portion of the season, and they all had their side/connections, as well as their romances. Julian ends up sending Danielle home after the latter volunteered to be a pawn, and the feud between the two of them really didn't lead to anything interesting happening, since it's in general just a bunch of passive aggression behind one another's backs. The following week, Tom is getting ready to send Suzette out the door for payback, and they take a few shots at one another during the week, and Anil gets cursed out by Suzette before he is twisted out of the game. The one somewhat interesting week of the pre-jury is when Gary wins HOH, though they redid the competition after Emmett, who was initially the HOH, was caught cheating, and there's quite a lot of infighting with the Quattro Alliance, though I don't think it was good for Alec and Peter to push so hard for Tom to go home. Anyways, there's quite a bit of drama here, and the week ends with Tom and Liza unceremoniously going home as it is the double eviction. The final week of the pre-jury ended on a dud, where Alec, the person who makes the safest moves ever, wins HOH and he decides to take out Suzette, since people don't want her in jury and he wants to make the safe move, and Emmett kinda shit on Suzette on her way out of the season. In general, there's really not a whole lot happening with the season, especially on a gameplay point of view, and while the cast is pretty good, the dynamics weren't the most interesting at this point. A part of me really was considering to put the season as dead last in this category, and it's sad coming to the realization over the last year that this season has not held up well over the last decade, especially compared to its successors. We have Topaz winning HOH, as she would have been one of the people who could have made a move to make the season more interesting, but she was told it was an instant eviction, and everyone was able to hear her thoughts, so her pawn AJ ends up going home over her target Andrew, since Alec and Peter saw no use in her when they should have. Andrew then wins HOH, and of course nominates Topaz again, with Gary being the true target, which neither one of them really knew about. Topaz and Gary did cause some drama in the week, but it was kind of saddening as well. And Gary, of course, ends up going home. Jillian wins HOH and makes a promise to Topaz so she could be given HOH, only for Jillian to break every single condition that was made in the deal by not only nominating Alec next to Peter, my bad, but then nominating Topaz as a replacement, despite Jillian promising to not do either. Despite this, there's really no drama or intrigue happening during that week, and this portion of the season just felt very static, despite a few solidly decent moments. I am shocked that this is the highest category that I ever gave BBCAN 1 regarding certain points in this season, but it does make sense in hindsight, since the endgame is usually what people speak of the most regarding this season. This portion of the season starts with the second double eviction, where Topaz is easily sent home after Emmett convinces Peter to not veto her. Ultimately, we have Jillian winning HOH, and she actually gets her way for once over Emmett in getting Peter out of the house, and the relationship between Andrew and Tala starts to fall apart here, and Emmett has his last cheating meltdown happening here. The second Final Five happens when Gary returns to the house via Canada's vote, and Emmett uses this to his advantage, so Andrew can get booted, which Jillian did not want. More Andrew and Tala bickering happens, and the both of them are easily booted at this point. Gary ends up booting Emmett at the final three, which some saw as shocking, and then we have the infamous final two, where Jillian accidentally wins, due to Topaz being too petty to not realize what fault she was placing in the socket. Literally, this is classic reality TV, and there's nothing like it anywhere. Outside of the moment, there are a few watchable moments that make the endgame not a complete bore, but I hate that Gary returned in what was the final four. Okay, so the next season is BBCAN 3, which is 7th at 7.14. That's where I have it now, and I had it at 7th a year ago when I rewatched all the seasons. I'm going back and forth between this season and another season regarding whether it should be 6th or 5th, but I'm deciding with BBCAN 3 right now, and there's a huge gap between this season and the other 4 seasons pertaining the casts. One of the reasons why I chose this season instead of the other season is that it has a 16-player cast, and I still have less of an opinion on this cast compared to the other, which has a shorter cast. Risha and Neha seemed like solid casting choices, but neither one of them had much to do before they were cut early in the season. Craig is the very typical type of person in his archetype regarding what he brings, but I do find him to be a more boring version of his archetype, if that makes sense. Johnny came off as very cringeworthy on the edit and didn't add much to the season, and on the feeds, he was very quiet, so he was either very quiet and not doing anything, or very cringeworthy and doing too much on the edit. Jordan, of course, had his great rise and fall, which has become a very iconic BBCAN moment, even though he was trying too hard to be a rapper on the feeds. By rapper, I mean RHAP, per which he eventually accomplished, but it was too much for him once it became a reality. Kevin got a very overinflated edit for little reason, though you can tell that he was a production pet, but I was always neutral at best on him regarding his personality and what he brought to the season in reality. Bobby and Willow did not contribute much to the season and are pretty forgettable in the grand scheme of things. Cindy is very dynamic and chaotic, who made the most of her limited time on the season, so she is definitely a standout. Bruno did have his moments throughout the season that are memorable, especially the triple, so while he isn't the most interesting, I can't say he is a dud compared to many others. I think it's so laughable that Zack, of all people, became the big villain of the season. Though he's just a normal ass guy, though he still falls under the quote unquote generic hunky good player archetype. Pilar was a dud who offered nothing to the season, and Ashley was very similar until her underdog arc during the final 2 weeks of the season. Brittany and Sarah were rootable underdogs, though Brittany came off as contrived at times in the diary room. And Sarah is such a unique person and brought a lot of levity and likability to the season, while also being very dramatic and having interesting gameplay, I'll just put it that way. There was literally no one like Godfrey, and he brought much needed life to the season, though he started the annoying speech trend, which thankfully died out in the more recent seasons. I think the cast, being all superfans, definitely did not help, since they were not the most dynamic, but they did gel well enough together. Though the twists, unfortunately, hampered the cast and the dynamics that could have resulted had they just let them play the game on a simple matter and let them really do what they wanted to do with all the cut-through moves and all that jazz. I'm going back and forth about this cast when it comes to the gameplay. This cast had the most superfans in any season ever regarding North American Big Brother, if I remember correctly, and they all wanted to play the game very hard. I remember watching the feeds when they turned on, and the entire house had so many alliances, whether they were in large groups, small groups, duos, and trios, where half of them didn't even make it onto the episodes pertaining the alliances that were formed. There was the Chop Shop Alliance, which only Willow, Greg, Bobby, and kind of Bruno took seriously, where Godfrey was a subsidiary of that group. A majority of the women plus Johnny were in a group, and I think it was all the women but Ashley, Pilar, and Willow, if I remember correctly. But that group lost some numbers earlier on in the season to the point where it was mainly just Sarah and Brittany. Jordan and Zach were in the middle of the house, with Zach having more relations on one side and Jordan having more relations on the other side, where they controlled a lot of the first half. Ultimately, a lot of moves were prevented or halted altogether due to the weekly twists that were thrown into the season, and it got very frustrating to watch after a while. There was also the game flipping on Jordan and Zach during the latter's HOH week, though a twist caused that to happen, and that twist being Cindy's return and her returning after nominations were already done. And it really was the Diaper Alliance winning out over the next few weeks after that, where they would have dominated the season, but a bunch of twists came into play, especially the coup d'etat. It just got really frustrating. While there are definitely some great moments gameplay-wise, I really think it could have been an all-star or all-tier gameplay cast if they just left things alone, where a lot of interesting things could have happened. So as we have seen in Canada and US, with twists, they often make the gameplay of those seasons more boring and ruins whatever positive momentum was happening. Unfortunately, we have a few decent moments, but the gameplay is just disappointing in general, especially since there are fans, and they know how to handle the twists by playing around them. I also think that due to them being so many fans and them generally being lower personality in general, a lot of them knew how to lay under the radar. Though they wanted to play aggressively and knew what moves needed to be made, they knew that taking the quieter approach more often than not, especially with the twists, was the way to go, which led to a lot of disappointments pertaining the gameplay. I thought that one other season would potentially be last regarding the drama, but I forgot about this season. I ended up forgetting about this season regarding the drama because there really wasn't much of any drama outside of one or two notable moments, which caused the season I initially was going to put as last to be moved a spot or two above this. There's not much drama in BBCAN 3, and that's mainly due to the cast being predominantly super fans who know the formula too well and are more muted personalities in general. There was not much drama within the first 2 weeks outside of that cringe thing with Sydney and Godfrey, which was based off a prank production set up, and there wasn't much fallout over Kevin hearing the woman's conversation. The first real blow up was Johnny vs. Greg over the latter being backdoored, and the former winning the veto, but it was more cringe than anything. Even the fallout over Jordan's blindside was pretty boring, and not much came from it in a dramatic lens, since Zach and Sarah talked about it in a very calm and concise way. The only other notable drama that I remembered was when Bruno and Sarah had that huge argument during the triple, which was very good, but it was also very short, so you didn't see a whole lot of immediateness or payoff to it, though we saw a bit of passive aggression between him and Brittany and Sarah in the following week, which led to him being cooed out of the game. This cast in general just doesn't have much drama, especially compared to literally all the other seasons, so I have no choice but to put it as last. Though I think a part of the reason why there isn't as much drama in this season is due to the twists of the season being too much, causing them to be even more muted, where if the gameplay just played out more naturally without the twist, maybe we would have seen more drama from this cast. And this is the second category in a row that I'm marking this season as last in, which is interesting. So this season is known for having a bunch of twists, and they were throwing anything at the wall to see what stuck, and I don't think any of them stuck. There was a stupid twist in the first week where Canada had the sole vote to evict based on the nominees, and we only had one episode to base off of, and that one episode taking place on day one. And while Risha would have went home on a normal vote anyways, it was definitely a lame way to start the season. The instant eviction completely sucked, and it's not a shocker that they stopped doing it after this season, since there is some momentum going and Neha would have been an interesting player to see get out of the jam that she was in. But it really wasn't that much of a twist by this point in time, and there was also the double veto during Bruno's HOH week, which would have never been used since he was the HOH and had to be forced to get more blood on his hands, though he was allegedly thinking about potentially backdooring Zack at this point. I don't know if I have that correctly, but he was definitely thinking about doing something else, but the double veto scared him. While the pre-Dory returnee twist was cool and all, the way they did it sucked, as Cindy returned a day after the week already started and after the nominations already took place, and then she had to fight to get safety. It did lead to the Jordan blindside, but it also prevented Zach from backdooring Bruno, which could have been just as chaotic based on how Bruno is when things aren't going his way and he's at the bottom. There was the triple eviction, which is definitely a good twist, and that pulled off some of the only drama that took place in the season, so I have to say that it is a win and might bump the season up, despite me not liking most of the twists in the season. And then there is the coup d'etat, which I am not fond of, since it is decided by Canada's vote, though they made Sarah and Brittany have to compete against one another in the half-non. So, it wasn't just given like it was to Jeff in Big Brother 11, but I didn't like it being introduced during the season, and I didn't really think the payoff was worth it. Ultimately, the season would have been a lot better without the twists, which I have discussed ad nauseum at this point, which is why I am talking it heavily. A part of me is shocked that the pre-jury of the season is so low, when it really shouldn't be. One thing that should have benefited this season regarding the pre-jury is that it is very short, as it is only 4 weeks, but it all just falls flat. The first week starts off pretty weirdly, since there's no HOH competition or HOH at all, and they don't have access to most of their stuff. Risha was the house target, and they did all of the nomination/veto sanctions within the first day of the week. Everyone is kind of just sitting around making thousands of alliances that are hard to keep track of and aren't even on the episodes, where Russia is voted out by Canada instead of the House. The second week has the first HOH and Bobby win, and he initially wanted to send the sketchy Kevin home, but right after the nominations, Kevin overhears the woman talking about the guys in the washroom and exposes it to the guys, though he wasn't knowing about the Top Shop alliance that had power. Of course, that changes the target to Cindy, and she's unceremoniously sent home. The third week is definitely a mixed bag, and a mix of good and bad. as it had the final instant eviction ever, where Neha was making some inroads after Kevin already nominated her, and we had underdog Brittany winning HOH and shutting down the Top Shop Alliance, where she got Greg backdoored, though he shouldn't have been the person she targeted, and there's definitely some drama in this week. The final week of the season regarding the pre-jury ended in a complete bore as Bruno wins HOH to send home Johnny, who sulked over Kevin not caring, and he went home unceremoniously. I think things would have been more interesting and the dynamics would have been stronger had the twists not been thrown in, since this was the cast that wanted to play hard and to create their own methods to do such. I never in my wildest dreams or imagination thought that Big Brother Canada 3 would be high on any tier list I have, since I pretty much have talked poorly about it on my channel for years, especially it being first on a specific list. This is really surprising to me, but you better expect this to probably be the only time that the season is this high on a list. Anyways, we have one of the most infamous weeks ever in Big Brother Canada history, with Zach winning HOH and Jordan asking to be put up because he celebrated too much. Cindy returns to the game after the nominations, and Zach backs out of backdooring Bruno due to it, leaving Jordan on the block. Ultimately, half the house completely flips by booting Zach's closest ally on his own HOH, and Godfrey's reaction and coming back to life was just really funny and iconic. The following week was pretty boring, I will admit, for sure, as Cindy getting sent right back out didn't really add much to the season. The following week is a very good week, but it was mainly due to the triple eviction, and while Bobby's veto lie could be a contender, or considered a key, seeing the Diaper Alliance run things was really getting tiring at this point in the season. What put this season this high is easily the triple eviction, and what makes it even better is that before it happens in the final 6, it is solely tied to this portion of the season, as the final 10, final 9, and the final 8 triple eviction happens in this portion, and it doesn't overlap like a lot of the other triple evictions. So, Brittany pulls off a clutch HOH win and nominates all of the Diaper Alliance, but Ashley. Bruno wins the veto and shockingly saves Zach to be a shield, and people always talk about doing this but never does it, and the two really weren't allies at this point in the season. Instead of doing the sensical move of nominating Ashley, the other Diaper Alliance member that isn't nominated and is eligible to be nominated, Brittany nominates Willow, and Sarah choosing to save Pilar instead of Willow. She didn't think the votes were there to save Willow after her huge blow up with Bruno, which is great. It's just so chaotically good. The aftermath of the triple definitely carried into the final 7, and while there was some drama with Bruno, I really did not like the coup d'etat, and it almost caused me to put it at second. In general, there's just so many iconic moments during this portion of the season, and it's easily the best that BBCAN 3 has to offer. And in general, I was stuck between this season and 2 other seasons, between where I rank them regarding their endgames. I feel like this season is the worst in that regard, since all the juice was out of the season by the time of the endgame completely. Sarah wins HOH, and Zach wins out of cat lives as he's on his 9th life, and he is essentially sent home very easily in this round. The final double eviction of the season happens here, where Brittany ends up winning HOH, and Ashley continues her veto streak, causing Pilar to go home. Sarah wins HOH again, and Ashley is the target again, but she wins the veto, and Brittany doesn't have any more lives either, since her cat lives are gone, so she goes home here. The final 3 in itself is pretty unpredictable with who could win, since apparently each of them had one scenario where they could win, but watching the final 3 was just not very interesting. Godfrey makes the worst choice for his game by booting Ashley, and Sarah easily beats him. In general, the season was running on very little themes by the time we got to the endgame, so while it isn't a pain in the butt to watch, like the 2 below it, there really isn't anything good about it either. Ending the top half is Big Brother Canada 4 at 6th, with a score median of 6.43. I had this at 8 after my rewatch of the series last year, so I felt worse on it than I did in the past, and now that I went through all the categories, I bumped it back up, so now it's roughly in the middle. And just from looking at the scores here, it didn't really have a season where it was last, compared to some of the other seasons where they had a lot of 10th places and a lot of lower scores, while things were kind of all over the place with This season and a few decent placing ranks caused it to be in the middle here. BBCAN 4 has by far the most unlikable cast out of all the seasons, and it's not even close. Despite them being unlikable, I don't think it's the weakest cast, since a lot of them did contribute to the season, and it did lead to an interesting dynamic. I'm just going to say from the jump, a good amount of the P-jurors are very forgettable and didn't add anything to the season, like Paige, Shari, and Christine. Dallas was very gross on the live feeds, but his presence did cause people to really freak out, and he could be entertaining at moments while not overstaying his welcome. And Levita added a much needed presence pertaining to the drama and the strategy of the season, even though everything she did failed, and she pissed everyone off, while not overstaying her welcome, since she was starting to get old. Mitchell is someone who offered so much to the strategy of the season and was a major component of the three alliance dynamic of the season, but he did not get much of an edit until his downfall week, where he was very entertaining, but I couldn't really say that he was consistently entertaining just based on what we saw of him on the episodes, though he was more entertaining on the feeds. Raul was a bordering on being a dud, but he was also someone who was very easy to laugh at, and he had his moments that definitely brought something to the season. Maddie and Jared were both very unlikable, despite being on opposite sides of the house, but offered a lot to the season pertaining to the drama they caused. Jared was the strategic leader of their alliance for a while, or his alliance, and Maddie made so many personal moves throughout the season. Nikki and Tim offered a lot of the comedic relief to the season and brought some much needed likability, where there wasn't a whole lot of with the cast. Joel was a decently likable presence, though he is one of the more forgettable people, especially once you're not immediately watching the season. It's very easy to kind of just forget about him. And Kelsey and the Paquette brothers were irritating, though Kelsey has her moments of being somewhat endearing, while the brothers were just annoying, but I don't know if they were duds. Cassandra is easily the star of the season, as she brought a lot of humor, drama, and gameplay, while being one of the few people who seemed like she was actually having fun throughout the season. So while this season didn't have a lot of likable personalities, there were a few people who really took over that element of the season, and this was the first season I recall that really had a three alliance dynamic that held up for a majority of the season, and there were a lot of interesting dynamics through the season, which makes up for it compared to BBCAN 11 and BBCAN 7. What is funny about this cast is that they're known as some of the weakest gameplay-wise, and I do agree that for the most part, though I do prefer the gameplay of this season compared to a lot of the others, clearly. One of the main reasons is that throughout the entire season, I believe this season is the first in my recollection that has three sides of the house, which remained throughout the entire season. One side of the house included Maddie, Dallas, and Ramsey, with Levita and Sherry kind of being a part of them, and this took place during the first week, with Levita winning HOH, and them all being blindsided over the Paige vote, which ends up happening with the third week, once again with Christine getting booted. This side of the house is consistently making dumb moves, like Levita's two HOHs, Maddie deciding to target Levita on her HOH, Dallas pretty much asking to go on a block, Maddie and Ramsey blowing up their truce with Jared and Kelsey, so on and so forth. The other side of the house is the third wheel alliance with Kelsey, Jared, and Raul, who were an unbreakable trio throughout the season, but they also had other relationships with people like Cassandra, Mitch, and the Paquette brothers. I do think that a lot of the social connections came to pretty white privilege, especially with Jared and Kelsey, but they did have some decent ideas and ran their HOHs decently. But their entitlement definitely caused a lot of interesting things to happen and a lot of infuriating things to happen as well, which also benefited from the twist, mainly the Mitch boot, where it wasn't even the smartest thing for them to take out Mitch during that week. And especially for Raul's part, and even Jared was getting closer to Mitchell before Kelsey came back, so I don't think that was the best move for them. And then, of course, there was the middle alliance of floaters, which consists of Cassandra, the Paquette brothers, Mitchell, Joel, and Tim, where they were really the ones controlling the vote throughout the first several weeks of the season, and really pitted the two other alliances against one another. There was going to be a civil war that broke up the Middle Alliance, and new sides were being aligned due to the Dallas versus Maddie vote. Until the mid-season twist came in and Kelsey coming back, ruining that building dynamic and kept things the same for much longer than it would have. While the gameplay was not the strongest, the dynamics for the first two-thirds of the season was interesting and unique, though when the Pack brothers and Kelsey eventually got together during the last third of the season, it really made the season a lot less interesting from a gameplay point of view. For some reason, I think people forget a lot about the drama that happened in the season, though it has some of the best that BBCAN has to offer. We see the aftermath of the Paige blindside, where Shari and Levita handle Kelsey horribly after failing to boot her, and then we see Levita and Cassandra arguing the entirety of the next week as the former tries to get the latter out over a misunderstanding, and she fails at it. Apparently, there was a lot of drama during that Baseball Have Not competition that was edited out in the first week, and there were a lot more arguments with people like the brothers, Dallas, and some of the others on the feed at the time, which weren't included on the final edit. We did have a lot of the hatred between the two main sides of the house, and of course we have Jared and Levita getting into a screaming match, all because Kelsey was getting the boot, and he was blaming Levita for it somehow, and Levita getting into it with Maddie before the latter stupidly decided to evict her. Dallas really spat in Tim's face, metaphorically, I mean, in his final week due to the nomination system that Tim was trying to work off of, and he of course gets into it with Maddie due to her dumb HOH, which led them in a poor position. What they didn't show is the huge drama that happened with Tim, Cassandra, and Nikki as the back and forth with the House over the Dallas versus Maddie vote was taking place. Of course, Mitch aired out Raul, Jared, and Kelsey several times during his final week in the house, and even the trio got into it with one another a lot during the week as they snapped at Raul for talking too much. Maddie and Kelsey finally verbalized their hatred towards one another the next week instead of just shit-talking one another behind their backs all season. Jared and Cassandra had a huge blow-up since she ended up sending him home because he didn't play hard enough in the Vita competition to keep the nominations the same, and he is taking it very poorly since they know one another outside of the house, and of course the brothers and Kelsey are pissed off at her too. We also have the huge blow-up that took place in the Final Five with everyone but Joe, which kinda got uncomfortable at times with how aggressive the brothers got, and endgames are usually not that tense in drama. The cast being unlikable in general is definitely something that gave them a boost here in this regard, but while there is a lot of drama, I don't think it is as iconic as some of the fights and drama in the other two seasons above it. Regarding the twists in this season, I am kind of mixed on this season, since it isn't the worst, but it is far from the best either. It doesn't have as many twists as the season that came before it, meaning BBCAN 3, but it definitely had twists that made impact, for better or for worse. We did have the twist of the brothers playing together, which I thought was very lame and very stupid, but they didn't look alike enough to pull off a twin twist, and they never separated the brothers, which is something that was heavily speculated within the house and outside of the house. But honestly, it wasn't the worst thing ever, even though it was still kind of sucky. So it continued the twist of bringing people into the house after the first week, but they made it into nationals, and the options that did enter were very good, since Tim and Nikki brought some much needed likability throughout the season that was mixing with the main cast. Of course, the main twist of the season is the fake double eviction, where Kelsey and Levita were booted, but they were kept around for an extra week, where they were able to watch muted live feeds and compared notes on everything that was happening in the game. Of course, the house guests did not know this, and while Mitch's downfall caused for some good drama in the season, and some entertainment, we were getting something really good during the fifth week, and they were progressing, but bringing Kelsey back into the house just caused things to return to those old, tired ass dynamics, which was a shame because I would have liked to have seen the remaining weeks of the season play out with the dynamics that are being set up by week 5. Overall, one twist was horrid, though it did bring some good moments, but I think the twists in the other seasons were better, and the other twists in the season were either decent or didn't really affect much in the season in comparison. So that is why it is at 8th. I was going back and forth between this season and another season as to which pre-jury should be the seventh placer, but I ultimately settled with BBCAN 4. What I will say about the season is that stuff was always happening, and we started it off with some intrigue right off the board, as there was a blindside of HOH Levita as the pawn page went home over the target Kelsey, and it immediately split apart the house. The second HOH caused Jared, Kelsey Shermans, to get his payback with Levita and Shari, and while there was some interesting conflict, especially in the beginning of the week, and their target ends up staying again, I don't think it was a blindside, and the week was not very noticeable. Levita wins HOH again, and you would think that she would get revenge on Jared and Kelsey, right? Nope. She decides to go after Cassandra because she overheard Cassandra making a bad comment during the HOH competition, or after the HOH competition, and Cassandra was one of the reasons why Levita ended up staying last week. They had a bunch of arguments that was very entertaining, and we saw the metal group do their work again, where they flipped another vote and blindsided Levita again by keeping Cassandra and sending home Christine. The following week has Joel winning HOH to finally break up the trio by nominating Kelsey and Raul, only for Levita to get the blame and drama for that, especially from Jared, and Levita also ends up getting backdoored by ally Maddie in the double eviction. Dallas ends up torpedoing his game due to the aftermath of the double and refusing to take part of Tim's BBOS nominations. But the end of the week calls for a divide in the house that was really interesting, and the drama that led up to Maddie barely staying over Dallas. There was some interesting weeks and some boring weeks, but I think the cast just being so unlikable made this a bit worse. I'm so all over the place with this portion of Big Brother Canada 4, hence it being in the middle of the rankings. The first round/week of this portion of the season is easily the most controversial, as Kelsey returns to the house via a house vote over Levita, completely ruining the changing dynamics that was set up last week, causing for things to revert back to how they were in the first month of the season. Kelsey was able to watch muted live feeds and use this to blow up Mitch's game, but getting Raul to send him home when it wasn't in Raul's best interest, and while Mitch offered some entertaining moments throughout this week, specifically the inorganic twist and the reverted dynamic really pisses me off. The next week is also pretty boring, as Maddie ends up sending Raul home after he helps Jared win the veto, knowing that he would be the biggest option for a replacement nominee. The week after that really sucked, as the brothers were given HOH due to a stupid twist, nominates Maddie and Ramsey, which was frustrating to watch at the time. The former ends up quitting due to a family emergency, and the entire house trashing Maddie until she left that week wasn't comfortable to watch. The final round of this portion did get interesting, with Cassandra's father winning HOH for her and then having to turn on Jared, someone who she knows in real life, which caused for some great drama and definitely brought some intrigue that was missing over the last few weeks. This was another very easy choice to have this season very low on the Endgamers category. I will say that the endgame did start out pretty strongly, with Cassandra convincing Phil to not nominate her in the double, with the promise that she would not use the veto, but one, Cassandra did end up winning the veto, which was shocking in itself, but she used the veto on Tim, ruining the brothers' plans as Nikki went home. This caused for a tense endgame, as the brothers and Kelsey attacked Tim and Cassandra pretty hard at the final 5 round in a very cringy argument. They were nominated, and Joel made a mistake in the veto competition, where his game just spiraled out of control to the point that the pair was kept over him, despite the events of the week in the beginning. By this point, the lack of studying by Tim, Cassandra, and Joel really kicked to bite them in the butt here, where it paid off for the brothers and Kelsey, since they studied for weeks, and the rest of the season was just a steamroll, with Cassandra and Tim, the latter who essentially quit because he flopped at the second part of the final HOH, were picked off, and the brothers end up winning over Kelsey, which was somewhat controversial at the time, since people felt like Kelsey should have won, which says a lot about the brothers, or a little about them, because she was evicted. So the season that barely made it to the halfway point at number 5 is Big Brother Canada 2, which has a median score of 5.86. I did have the season at 3rd after my rewatches of the series, but my opinion has went down on it further after going through the 7 categories in more recent months. And it's interesting because I find the season to be a bit overrated, so I never thought that the cast would be number 1. though I'm still not really sure whether this season's cast should be number one or number two. But there's something special about this cast that definitely elevated the series overall, where the cast is definitely the main reason for that. Anik Anik was a unique personality, though we barely saw her. Kyle is a solid casting choice who can be douchey and sweet at the same time, where it would have been interesting to see how he adapted as the season continued. Paul is a huge pre-jury flameout who called people out, overplayed to hell and back, and really gave a different perspective, but he would have been exhausting had he lasted longer in the season. Aika isn't necessarily likable, but she brought a lot of drama and intrigue during the short time she was on the season. Andrew was definitely the big villain, and while he did have his moments, I didn't find him to be as entertaining or charismatic as others in his archetype. Sarah had a few decent moments, but she was one of the team of personalities on the show, with the team edit, if I remember correctly, as well. But she probably would have been a bigger personality on another cast. Kenny was definitely an interesting personality with how he can be charismatic one moment and then be an asshole in another. And using his straight presentedness was something to talk about, I'll say that. Artie is someone that I found extremely contrived and try hard, but I don't think he was necessarily a dud, though I don't think he was able to pull off his full potential as a player. Allison might have been interesting if she was there from the very beginning, but she was kind of boring, stifled, and didn't have much to do on the season. Rochelle's dynamic with Sabrina became entertaining as the season went on, though she herself was kind of boring and not notable at all. Adele was very likable, though he could be confrontational at times and could be a bit too pandering pertaining to the Canadian audience overall. Heather was a likable person who grew into her own player and person throughout the season, though a part of me wonders if she would have been more or less notable if it wasn't for the treatment that she received in the beginning of the season. Netta is definitely the first person you think of when the season comes up, as while she definitely comes off as a gamebot at times, you could definitely tell that she has a lot of personality, was enjoying the game at or enjoying playing the game, and there's definitely a more devious side to her that wasn't focused on because of the underdog position she was in throughout the first half. Sabrina is definitely a dynamic house guest, as she was an overpowering pawn for the majority and a whining train wreck when she was an underdog, but she always provided. John was the one of the more John was one of the more likable guys throughout the season, though I think he mainly benefited from his interactions with more dynamic people, though he could have been more boring than others in his archetype, so he wasn't the most boring, if that makes sense. Overall, this cast just had a really good, interesting vibe and dynamic throughout the season, though a part of it was definitely artificial due to the America's H Canada's HOH twist, but we'll get more into that once I discuss the other elements of the season. I don't know if this placement will shock a lot of people, and it somewhat shocked me, but it makes a lot of sense when you think about it. In general, the season is really just two steamrolls split into halves, as the first 4 weeks of the season was the domination of the first 5 alliances, which consisted of Sabrina, Sarah, Andrew, Kenny, and Arlie, as they made the alliance before anyone else entered the house, and really had the connections throughout the house to run things. There was the Unstable Girls Alliance in the beginning of the season, with the likes of Rochelle, Aika, Netta, Sarah, and Sabrina, with the latter two playing double agent, if I remember correctly. But they made infuriating move after infuriating move, and they in general just were not likable. And the first 5 were also not the most likable either, but they were mainly able to control things by setting Sabrina up to be a mole. The second half of the season is then run by the Sloppy Seconds Alliance, which includes people like John, Netta, Heather, Arlie, and Adele, and even Allison for about 2 weeks, if I remember correctly. And I do like coups in Big Brother, but this one was not earned and it was extremely artificial. Canada's HOH had to do what the House would not do in nominating 2 members of the first 5 alliance, and many of them stated in the diary room that they wouldn't have taken the shot that Canada took during that week, which further proves my point. And due to the knowledge of who is and is not liked by Canada, I do think that affected the season in how people aligned with one another afterwards, as they knew some people were not liked by Canada and others were. So they wanted to be with the people that were liked. especially if there's a twist that came into the game. John and Neda did make some impressive moves throughout the second half of the season, especially with how they handled the early week, but the others in the alliance were so blind to what was happening and what they needed to do, especially the likes of Heather and Adele. Overall, there's not a whole lot happening in the gameplay of the season, and some of the changes were just very unnatural, hence its relatively low placement here. And it doesn't have the most dynamicism regarding the gameplay. I might, emphasis on might, move this up to 7th, but I had no choice but to put the season lower for a few reasons. One is that there really wasn't much drama as the season went on, and most of it was in the beginning of the season, where there really isn't much of anything at the end of the season. And one of the things I'm taking into consideration with this list is there being drama throughout the beginning, middle, and end of a season. So if there's a season that has most of its drama in only one section of the season, it's probably going to be lower. The other main reason why I put the season low in the drama arena is because a lot of the drama was edited out of the episodes. Like, we did see Paul call Andrew a racist and the blow up that happened, but they didn't show the entire house getting into Adele and Cal's asses as well, which explains why the three of them were so on the outs. Ika did blow up her own alliance by causing random fights with them throughout the season, mainly throughout the week of her HOH, but they don't show any of it on the episodes. And then we have her infamous blow up due to Litigate, which was really great. They also did not show her and Sabrina's arguments that happened during that week, where Sabrina lied and said Ika tried to threaten her physically. Andrew and Kenny had the few fights with people during the season, and then things slowed down during the jury portion of the season, despite all of Adele and Sabrina's fights later on in the season. It seemed like the producers wanted to push the Canada-friendly image this season, hence editing out a lot of the drama compared to BBCAN 1. But what we got from the episodes and the feats were decent enough. In general, I don't think it compares to a lot of the drama that happened in the seasons after this. So, here it is in this ranking. And you would expect for a cast that showed to be more explosive and had a lot of personality to have more drama. But I think that the artificial twist that happened in the middle of the season, causing or incentivizing the more likable quote-unquote people to stay in the house, caused there to be less drama. Honestly, I don't think there were that many twists in the season, which is shocking since there's a decent amount in the seasons that it's sandwiched between, like Big Brother Canada 1 and Big Brother Canada 3 especially. There was the voting in a new house guest to enter the house after the first week twist that BBCAN tends to do, or they tended to do during the first half of their run, and while I don't care for it at all, in general it's pretty harmless here in the grand scheme of things, though Allison definitely suffered gameplay-wise due to entering the game 2 weeks late. Oh, I also forgot that she had to watch in the secret room, and I guess the secret room is a twist since Neda had to go up there as well to figure out who she would nominate during the instant eviction, which I could also say was a twist, but it was also expected during the first 3 seasons of the country. Anyways, there was the twist of someone having to find the secret veto, which I found was cool enough, but it's pretty inoffensive as well. And while Allison did use it, it wasn't this huge move, really, that she or the country or the producers were expecting. The main twist of this season is Canada's HOH, and I outright hate it. While I did not like the first 5 alliance running things at all, and the members in that alliance were for the most part unlikable, I do like natural coup d'etats, and everything about the other side coming together came off as very contrived, since Canada had to make the move, not them, and most of them mentioned that they wouldn't have done that move that week, and people decided to work together based on who was liked by Canada. It ended one steamroll throughout the first 4 weeks and would have continued on had this not been put in place, and caused another steamroll for the last 6 weeks of the season. I forgot about that veto replacement thingy that Adele won early on in the season, and while it was lame, it had no effect on the season. So, there are less twists here, and most of them are inoffensive, but the big twist of the season is a huge negative. The season is very frustrating to talk about regarding the pre-jury of the season, since there are a decent amount of good and not good moments. We start off the season with Paul winning HOH and sending home Anik, though we saw a bit of the tension during the little that we saw of that week overall. The second week involves Andrew winning HOH, and of course he wanted to get his lick back revenge on Paul when he nominated Paul next to Netta. And then Andrew was called a racist and a sexist, only for the entire house to defend him and yell at Paul, as well as Paul's allies, though they didn't show that part on the episode. Kyle ends up getting backdoored at the suggestion of Kenny that week, and Ika ends up winning the next HOH, where we are expecting her to make a huge move against the dominant First Five Alliance, and she knew that those guys specifically were targeting her, but nope! She alienates her few allies, nominates a horrible pawn in Paul, has a weak target in Heather, and the worst part is, her pawn ends up staying. Rochelle ends up winning HOH, where she is thinking about targeting Heather again, but then she's tricked by Sabrina to take out Ika, which was dumb as hell, but it was Ika's karma, and she delivered the great letter shredding moment, and of course there's that yelling match that happened after that, as well as the drama between Sabrina that didn't make it onto the episodes. I have already discussed my opinions on Canada's HOH very thoroughly over the last year, and how much I really dislike it, but while it broke up the First Five Alliance, the week itself is pretty boring, and there's so much pandering from the house guests, and they couldn't really plot too much since Canada was in control. And the fact that this flip was given to the other side instead of them really earning it really just took the wins out of me. And the final week of the pre-jury has the other side, their name really not ringing a bell at the moment, wiping out Sarah and Kenny with little interest or intrigue. Overall, the pre-jury started out very strong, but it fizzled out during the last few weeks of the pre-jury. And a large part of me really wants to move this to 8 in this regard when it's all said and done. One of the main reasons why this jury portion is so low on the list is that it is extremely short, which is a result of the pre-jury being way too long, meaning that there's only 2 rounds in this period. The first round involves John winning HOH and is set on splitting up the goblins, but Netta is able to get into his head with some great manipulation in order to get him to target early. Allison ends up using her secret veto, where John is forced to nominate an ally, and the goblins plus Allison have the power to flip the vote to boot Adele, but John and Netta are too convincing of the goblins. And then the only other round of this portion of the season is the instant eviction, where Netta easily and unceremoniously sends Allison home. Essentially, this period of the season only takes place in a week, which is why it's so lackluster in general. A part of me is, and is not shocked that the endgame is ranked in this position, and it was not in my intention to put most of the early seasons this low in this category. By this point in time, it was clear that John and Netta were in full control of the game, and it was clear that someone was going to drag Sabrina to the end. Rachel goes home against Sabrina on Adele's HOH, and while there's some back and forth between Sabrina and Adele, there wasn't a whole lot happening at this point. John wins the next HOH and intends to take out Heather. Most of the house is actually planning this, but she wins the veto and escapes her eviction by a round, and Adele unceremoniously goes home. You see the tension between Netta and John start around this point in the season, as he realizes how self-interested Netta is with how she handled Adele's eviction, and while we knew that she was going to cut him at third, no one knew that he was going to cut her at third, so seeing him do it was actually shocking. John of course steamrolls Sabrina, and I will say that while this endgame itself is pretty boring, there were some decent moments that does make it watchable. At fourth is Big Brother Canada 9. And this one is shocking to me because since it took place, this was my favorite Big Brother Canada season, and after rewatching all the seasons, it was still my favorite Big Brother Canada season. But after going through all the categories, it only got at fourth, and I think it's because it never got first place in a category where the other 3 above it has gotten first at least once, and most of the scores here are fourths and thirds and a fifth, so I guess it makes sense as to why it is here. So I'm going back and forth about whether this season should be number 1 or number 2 pertaining its cast, and even after writing and recording this, my opinion could easily be changed. Julie is a pretty notable first boot who definitely had personality, though didn't have much to do. Josh was a very unique and interesting person during the 2 weeks he was there, and just the way he handled things had me mystified. Latoya really had an I don't give a fuck attitude, and the way she carried herself really intrigued me, and I liked how she played hard throughout her short time on the season. Kyle is arguably the only dud on the season, and he really didn't have much personality, and was just awkward to watch, and it makes sense why he barely got any diary rooms. Austin definitely had a princess vibe to her, but she wasn't over the top or manufactured like some others in her archetype during BBCAN. Victoria is extremely unique, as she is someone in her archetype. Victoria doesn't even really have an archetype, but she is someone who's just very entertaining, as she can be very likable, but it's also very infuriating, but she's just unapologetically herself, and made the season a lot more electric just by her presence. Rohan was a cool guy who definitely had his confrontational moments, and he had the personality to be an interesting, charismatic underdog, which is something that is very undersold on reality TV, since there are a lot of underdogs who just aren't charismatic or interesting at all. Tina is the only other person that could arguably be considered a dud, in my opinion, since she didn't have much personality, and despite high hopes, she was a dud pertaining the game as well. Jetson and Beth were chaotic and fun presences individually, but they just brought those traits out in one another even more when they were together, so they definitely made the season better. There is no one on Big Brother that is like Kiefer, where he is really likable and was a better player than expected, but he can also be really arrogant in every element where it is annoying. Tara was boring in the first half of the season, though she was trying to play aggressively and had more life than someone like Tina, but then she became her own during the second half of the season, as she really had an I don't give a fuck attitude, got herself in some drama, and really just pushed for what she wanted as a game player. And I really appreciated the fight that she had during the second half of the season. Brayden was kind of in between, as he was low key overall, but he did have some moments throughout the season. Tashawn was a chaotic mess as well, but it's overshadowed by Jetson and Beth, though he became too much of a reckless savage during the last few weeks in the season. Overall, I think this cast had a really great dynamic, which is why they're so high, as well as most of the cast offering something to the table, where it had less duds than most of the other seasons I've discussed. So, this cast is known as being one of the weakest when it comes to the gameplay capability, but some of the most interesting gameplay on a cast on a whole usually comes from people who are not the very best, and they don't have the template studied down to every detail as to what they should do. Of course, the team's format in the first 2 weeks of the season encouraged two sides to be formed, though it wasn't everyone on the same team in the same alliance, if that makes sense. The Sunsetters consisted of Latoya, Jetson, Tashawn, Tina, Kiefer, and Beth. I believe that's it, and I don't think I'm missing anyone. And the other side that formed a week or so later mainly consisted of Rohan, Kyle, Austin, Brayden, Tara, and Victoria was kind of just added on. And those sides remained consistently throughout the season in some variations. A few stragglers were taken out in the first 2 weeks, which was heavily led by the Sunsetters, but then Victoria targeting Latoya caused a change in the house, as the other side realized that they needed to stick together. Unfortunately for them, Kiefer won the next HOH to boot Kyle, though they were still united, and Victoria wasted her invisible HOH to boot Austin, who was not a threat and wasn't coming after her, because I guess she wanted to work with Deshawn and Jetson, but that wasn't happening after she booted Latoya. Victoria became a lone wolf before her mid-season boot. Tara and Tina got closer to one another over anyone else throughout the season, and I believe they had an alliance with Kiefer from very early on in the season. And Brayden realized that he needed to get closer with people from the other side of the house, which is what we saw especially with Tashawn. The trio of Tashawn, Beth, and Jetson, with Kiefer being an ally, seemed like they were going to steamroll the season with their weird choices and their erraticness. Like them trying to backdoor Kiefer on Jetson's HOH, only to not go through with it after nominating him. And then there was the complete clusterfuck of the final six by everyone, which led to Jetson choosing to save Beth with the veto and getting blindsided. Things got a bit slower after that, though we did see the emotional cutting of Kiefer and Tashawn flirting with Brayden to get to the end. While the gameplay was not record breaking or anything else, people were playing their asses off, even if they weren't doing the right moves, and that's what made it fun. I am definitely more confused about the position of this season in the drama department, since I could move it up a spot or two maybe, but I feel like here is a good spot for it. We had this weird exchange with Latoya and Julie in the first week, where she refuses to engage with Julie's foolishness. Josh did get into a lot of drama during the 2 weeks that he was in the house, and I like the way he handled himself in these arguments, like the house meeting that happened in his final week. Rohan and Cal trying to intimidate Kiefer, only for Latoya to interrupt and hand their asses on their butts and on the floor and hand them their reading rights was just so hilarious to watch. Latoya, Jetson, and Tishan were just very savage during the entire week, and Victoria trying to deflect all week was pretty fun as well. I don't remember a whole lot of the drama for the next 2 weeks of the season, though the invisible HOH did not help in this department, but that was not the case for BBCAN 11 2 years later. Victoria and Tara had one of the best arguments ever during the latter's final week, and it was all about the game and nothing personal, which is very fun. We saw a lot of arguing with the trio, especially the showment of Beth and Jetson during the next few weeks, since they were so indecisive and scatterbrained, and even Kiefer got into some arguments with them as well, especially after they tried to backdoor him and then changed their mind. Of course, there was the final six round, which was just very dramatic in so many ways, and everyone was getting a piece of the drama pie. Tishan and Beth argued a lot during our last week in the house, which was pretty fun, though it was awful jury management on his part, and then things started slowing down after that. There was a lot of drama in the season, though there were peaks and valleys, and I think the other four have some more memorable drama, and I think it's also more consistent where there wasn't several weeks in the season where there wasn't any drama compared to this season, which is why I have it as fifth. Looking at the list of twists in the season, there really is not many twists at all, and the ones that are included had a positive impact on the season. There were the teams during the first 2 weeks of the season, and while we've seen this time after time on BBUSA especially, it can cause for some good dynamics, and it did during this season, while it was not formatted like this for long. The twist ended in 2 weeks, and we didn't have another twist until the fifth week, and even during those 2 weeks, there were still alliances that had people in both groupings. And we also had the first iteration ever of the invisible HOH, which was introduced here. Of course, Victoria ended up winning the week, and since she's so unpredictable, under a normal HOH, with this HOH, no one knew what she was going to do. She ended up targeting Austin of all people, and what's funny about this twist is that people were able to find out about her being HOH, and that led to crazy events during the next week. While it was not the most dramatic here, like it was in BBCAN 11, it was utilized well here. And the final twist that we have of the season is the fake double eviction, which was obviously in BBCAN 4, but it was handled very differently here. They did it in the endgame instead of the beginning of the season, so I guess they cannot hide the two evicted members for a week. But they had to compete in a competition the same day of the fake double. And I also think, because it happened during an already chaotic week, made it even better. Overall, the twists here didn't really make a whole lot of changes to the season, but there were definitely positives here, and it did likely elevate the season, which is what the twists are supposed to do. Let the game play out naturally, but just give it a little juice, a little sugar, a little seasoning that just lifts and elevates the season a bit more. And the twist in this season definitely did. Now that I think about it, this is definitely a season that I might have put too high regarding the pre-story, but I honestly don't feel like changing it right now. Of course, the twist of this season pertaining to teams caused half of the house to be saved and the rest of the house to be nominated. And if I remember correctly, everyone had to vote during the week, where Julie ended up going home due to Latoya flipping things last minute and saving Josh. Josh still entered the second week as the main target after he barely escaped the first round, and he did cause his fair share of drama during the week. And the house was still divided, and Jetson also throwing random as hell house meetings, though there was that failed flip to boot Rohan, which ended up with Josh going home. We get to the third week, where the other side decide to actually align once they realize that the Sunsetters are a thing, and it is such a rare thing in Big Brother, where the other side actually forming together once they realize the larger alliance has already formed. And Victoria has a crazy reign, where she goes after Latoya. The Sunsetters argue with Victoria, Rohan, and Cal throughout the week, making it very fun. Honestly, the following week is pretty boring, as Kiefer won HOH with the obvious Rohan and Cal nominations, and nothing of interest really happens, though them throwing Victoria under the bus would lead to Victoria, who wins the secret HOH next week, to target Austin, which she does win in the following week. I think the pre-jury starts off good, but it definitely fizzles out during the last 2 weeks of this pre-jury. While it is consistently enjoyable, it doesn't have the highest highs, and it not ending well caused it to damper on this category. I might end up switching the season with BBCAN 5 regarding where I place it in this category, though I'm still pretty unsure about it. We start this portion of the season with Beth winning HOH, and despite Jetson and Tashawn trying to control Beth's HOH, she made the right move in getting Victoria out, which is a much needed karma, but seeing Victoria and Tara go at it was fun, and it made for a good week, as Tara started to wake up finally. The double then happened, with Rohan going home here, really adding nothing to the season, and it's just in general very not notable, and one of the weaker double evictions from my recollection. The following week is where we have the flip-floppiness of Jetson and Beth, even Tashawn to a certain extent, appear here, as they plan to send home Kiefer, nominate him on the block, post veto, and then change their mind about keeping him after they already nominated him, only to boot Tina, who really did not offer much at all in the season. During the short portion that is this part of the season, in BBCAN 9, it offered a lot more than many other seasons regarding its endgame jury phase, and I feel like this season handled the shorter early jury portion a lot better than BBCAN 2 did, hence their differing placements on this category. The endgames from this point onwards are pretty solid, so I am kind of picking hairs from this point onwards. We have one of the most infamous final 6 rounds here, where everyone plays extremely poorly, with Tara almost ruining her move of sending Jetson home by nominating Brayden as the replacement nominee, Jetson winning the veto and using it on Beth, both Beth and Tashawn sending him home and handling it so poorly, and I don't even remember what Kiefer was doing here, but I'm sure he did something wrong as well. Tara was immediately sent home after her HOH, though the fake double eviction happened here, which was pretty interesting in how they handled it, and she had to compete against Jetson to come back in the house. Brayden decides to wake up and wins both the HOH and the veto that week, and he sends Beth home, who has a bunch of fights with Tashawn, which was just hilarious, though very stupid on his part with how he handled her eviction. The rest of the season kind of peters out from this point onwards, with Kiefer being a dead man walking, though it wasn't the best move for Tara to boot him at that point, and of course Tara ends up leaving again, where Tashawn beats Brayden. It's definitely the weakest portion of the season, but it's pretty strong overall. The bronze prize of third goes to BBCAN 6, with a median of 3.29, so it barely beat out BBCAN 9. My initial thought on this season, after rewatching all of them last year, was that I had it at 5th, due to the warpy edit at best, but when you really break down all of the categories and ignore that, the season holds up really well. I'm honestly kind of shocked that this cast is this low on the list, though the season is a really weird one when it comes to the casting. The women are some of the strongest, most polarizing women ever on the Canadian series regarding to what they contribute, and the men are some of the weakest and least polarizing men on the Canadian version as well. On one end of the spectrum, you have First Boot Rosina, who's one of the most unique people ever. Veronica definitely was a messy personality during her short time on the season. Erica is a mix of personality and being a comp beast while being rootable. Alejandra and Olivia made for a great dynamic duo throughout the season, and I even appreciate them individually. And do I even need to get into Kayla and Paris being utterly dynamic? Maddie is arguably the only female dud, though I think she would be a standout on a lot of other seasons, so it's just the competition that she is around. Regarding the guys, Andrew didn't get a lot to do, though even if he lasted longer, I don't think he would have been very interesting. Jesse only became somewhat interesting during his last few days in the season, but didn't do much in the first 2.5 weeks of the season, though he most likely probably had more personality than his main ally. Hamza definitely had personality, but also came off as way too cringe, and with the way he was shoved in our faces during the edit, really didn't do him any favors. Marin was an outright dud, despite being a very nice person who I'm sure is lovely in real life. Ryan had his loner arc, but I don't know if I call him a huge win in the casting department. Will was extremely cringeworthy, and it's ironic because it was clear he was supposed to be in the John archetype of being very likable, which so didn't come across well. Derek is a typical boring showman mate who learned the game as he went along, and while he had some what interesting moments during the latter parts of the season, it was mainly due to his dynamic with other people, rather than him on his own being dynamic or interesting. Johnny is arguably the only outright hit with the men on the casting point of view, as he reveled in being a villain and played the game while having a whole lot of personality and just having fun with it, but he barely got an edit on the season, where he was ignored for like the first 5 or 6 weeks of the season, and then he became a lot more prominent in his latter few weeks. And of course, with the inaccurate editing of the season that is infamous now, and a lot of the dynamics not being covered, the best of this cast wasn't even shown on the show, so they suffer from that. I'm going back and forth about whether the season should be first or second regarding the gameplay, but it is very close. We see in many other seasons of Big Brother Canada that the bedrooms tend to influence the alliances in the house, or at least the formation of alliances in the beginning of the season, and that isn't any more clear than in this season. There was the Red Room in the house, which consisted of people like Johnny, Ali, Olivia, Derek, Jesse, and Kayla, who did work together for a decent amount of the season, though it became looser and looser as the weeks went on. And the Right Room Alliance-ish consisted of people like Hamza, William, Paris, Maddie, Veronica, and some other people that I'm definitely forgetting about. Pretty much, the Red Room Alliance steamrolled the White Room Alliance at first, and despite there being an alliance with Paris, Jesse, Derek, and Kayla that formed in the beginning, that fell apart pretty quickly. Johnny had a lot of good relationships with everyone in the house, especially with people in the right room, and he was trying to target Derek and Kayla a lot earlier, as he was also the main reason why Jesse was targeted, since he convinced Hamza to target Jesse, and there was an interesting civil war with the Red Room that took several weeks to pan out, as many of the sectors and pairs within that group turned on one another and then made up with one another the next week, and it was just very interesting to watch. While the Civil War was building up, Erica wasted her HOHs on taking out people like Marin and Veronica, who wanted to work with her, and then we did see things change when Kayla won her first HOH, since she and Derek knew that they were huge targets, and Johnny needed to be handled. Erica was booted due to the stupid veto twist, causing there to be an extra week wasted on booting Ryan. Alejandra, Olivia, Kayla, and Derek were pretty much working together at this point, despite them having a fallout a few times throughout the season. But we had one of the greatest weeks ever with Alejandra and Kayla on the block, and the house went on fire, where Johnny really went scorched earth. Johnny and Kayla escaped some tight jams while they were targeted, being on the block during eviction night during the season, and it was very interesting. After the triple essentially wiping out an alliance, Derek was able to trick William into not saving his entire alliance, and Paris ended up beating out the unstoppable Showmans. There was so much in the game happening, which a lot of it didn't even make it onto the edit, and I couldn't even cover a bunch of it here, as everyone in the game was playing their asses off, which made the season's gameplay a lot more interesting and fun, but it just couldn't get. I do remember the feeds turning on immediately to see Andrew and Erica going at it for several rounds, which did make it out to the episodes, and I thought the entire exchange was so ridiculous, but so funny at the same time. And we move on to the next week, where we see Hamza and Jesse taking shots at one another throughout the week, though it was passive aggressive at the start, and then it just got worse and worse. We also have Veronica, which I actually forgot about, throwing a few house meetings that never ended well, and were very cringy to watch throughout the 3 weeks she was in the house, and she did it in two, or at least more than one of the weeks that she was there. If I do remember correctly, the Marin Boots week was pretty boring, but we did have that random argument between Alejandra and Ryan where we still don't know whether she said what he was alleging, but the way that she got so angry was just so hilarious to me. The next week was a build-up of a lot of tension within that Red Room quote-unquote alliance, as it culminated in Kayla being forced to name a nominee, causing Erica to go home, and telling the showmates to fuck off, essentially. This leads to Johnny and Kayla having a great face-off right after Erica left, and this led to the showmates trying and failing to send Johnny home, only for Johnny to try and fail to send the showmates home the following week, where they all went at it due to the anticipated Alejandra versus Kayla vote, which led to everyone trading words for like 12 to 18 hours. It was great to watch on the feed and on the episodes. And it ends up with Alejandra telling the house off, especially the trio, after she was evicted. I do remember the many arguments that the trio of Maddie, Paris, and Will got into during the season, but it became more heightened when one of them was going home in the final five, and seeing them gaslight Maddie was very uncomfortable. I will say that the season kept up the drama and antics from the beginning to the end, which is not the case for many seasons, and it is why it is number 2. But it's just missing something that put it at number. When I immediately thought about the twists on the season, it was hard for me to come up with anything initially, and I think it's because the twists did not cause much effect on the season, which honestly I kind of prefer. The first twist was that, of course, we have to vote two people back into the house, and they were based on angels versus devils, since that was the twist of, or the theme of the season, not a twist, but the theme. This caused Veronica and Marin, two angels, to come into the house, and while Veronica had her crazy moments, neither she or Marin lasted long in the season, or offered much to the table. And while Marin was a nice person, he was a complete dud on the season. Due to this, it caused for the late house entry twist in the second week, which we have seen in many early BBCAN seasons, which also just made the two of them stick out like a sore thumb. The next twist was the house division twist, where the one person who chose the blue eye cup in the intro on day 1 had to choose half of the house that was safe for the first week, which Andrew chose because he took the cup. It was only the people who were not safe were able to either win HOH, get nominated, or go home during that week. Chances are, I honestly don't see a whole lot changing, and Rosina probably goes home even without that twist, and if it was just a normal week 1. And the final twist was the Canada Save twist, which was pretty much the veto twist from the first season with Suzette, where you had the option to save one of the nominees or to not use it, and based on the edit, it was clear that they were heavily pushing Canada to vote to save Ryan. While we did get that great moment of Erica cussing Derek and Kayla out while she left and Johnny arguing with Kayla, we could have had a full week of this under normal circumstances, where Ryan really had nothing else to offer in the season and was running on fumes, where he ended up just going home unceremoniously the next week. While the twists in this season were not my favorite, it didn't screw up the season in the same way that the others did in other seasons, hence this being fourth. I was not sure about the season having the best pre-jury on the list, and for a while I did have it as second. It is one of the longer pre-juries, which could have been a fault, but I actually think it's a benefit this season, so when it has a dead week like the first week, it's not bogged down by it. There was the heaven and hell twist that split half of the house, where the house that was not safe had one member become HOH in Johnny, and the other being evicted in Rosina. Outsider Ryan wins the next HOH, and you would think that an interesting move would be made and the power would shift, but he caves on nominating his two allies in Hamza and Andrew to attempt to infiltrate into the majority, and the two nominees did try and failed to save Rosina the prior week. Andrew did cause some arguments in the beginning of the week, but he just kind of fizzled and the week ended very unceremoniously. Hamza wins the next HOH, and it's definitely one of the best weeks of the season, with Johnny convincing him to target Jesse, and the Red Room Alliance had to take a hit, which caused some drama with Jesse and Hamza, and Jesse kind of going down the hill. Erica wins HOH and decides to go after Veronica, though it was a very weird move, but Veronica had her house meetings that were just very cringe, and Hamza was sent home in a double eviction, where everyone got so damn emotional. And I thought it was pretty funny. Honestly, it's pretty akin to how people reacted to Judd during the double eviction in BB15. Erica wins HOH yet again, and right when she is getting suspicious of some of her Red Room allies, and knowing that a big move needed to be made, she wasted her HOH on getting out Marin, who was irrelevant to the dynamics. The final week of the pre-jury was clearly a build-up, where Kayla won HOH when most of the house was targeting herself and Derek, but she ended up going after Ryan, though because of the twist that was happening with Ryan being saved by Canada's veto, Kayla put Erica on the block, sent her home, and both Erica and Johnny lashed out at her. Overall, this pre-jury just really has it all. It has great gameplay, drama, some interesting dynamics, and it never really feels really slow or worthless. A part of me really wanted to put the season at first place with this category, since there's so much greatness that is within it, and that says a lot, since this portion is really only 2 days long. Ultimately, we have Derek winning HOH and targeting Johnny due to the latter targeting him and Kayla for a while now. Johnny and Ryan remain on the block, and Johnny pulls off a masterclass that causes everyone, even the people targeting him, to not only want to keep him during that week, but they do end up keeping him. The issue is they edited this really poorly, gave Alejandra the credit, and it takes the week down a notch, especially on a rewatch. Ultimately, one of the best weeks in Big Brother history happens here, as Johnny wins HOH and of course nominates the showmans. They pretty much pull off the same thing Jamaica did at this point in the past season, or in the last season, with Derek winning the veto, then convincing the trio to boot Alejandra. The fact that everyone was literally fighting for damn near 24 hours straight, and even during the live vote, the trio were very indecisive, and then Ali definitely leaving on a blaze of glory, was just really great to watch. It was a very fun period of Big Brother overall, and this season does the shorter early jury portion a lot better, hence it being higher than the other seasons. The triple also kind of happens here, but the most notable messy iconic stuff of that period, or of that week, happens during the final 8th round and not in the final 7/6, where the triple really happens. But the edit is mainly the reason why I can't put it at first, especially in this regard. I initially had this at third in this category, but then I really had to look at the triple to realize why I bumped it so high in the first place, and outside of that, there really isn't much to this endgame in comparison to the others, so I bumped it this low. Ultimately, the triple eviction in this regard, at least in the elements that fit into the endgame, was pretty boring, since it's just Johnny and Olivia easily getting booted, where the interesting stuff about this triple happened in the final 8, actually. Kayla ends up winning HOH. The trio are plotting on how to take out Derek on her HOH, but Derek pulls a fast one on Will in the veto competition, so it ruins that plan. Paris and Will gang up on Maddie during that week several times, which is uncomfortable to watch, and Maddie obviously goes home here, where a part of her kind of wants to go home. Anyways, Will goes home in the final 4 very easily, and Paris winning the final HH was pretty shocking, but she ended up booting Derek. And we also see herself and Kayla shouting their answers at the jurors, where Paris wins over Kayla, which was controversial at the time. There's some decent-ish moments, but in general, it just doesn't have many, if any, highs, but it doesn't really have the lows of other endgames. So there's actually a tie with the top 2 seasons, as they both have a median score of 2.86, but at second I'm ultimately choosing BBCAN 10, and one of them is that I ranked it at fourth after I rewatched all the seasons last year, and honestly, I just have more of a stronger impression slash hold for the season that's at first compared to the season that is at second, which is this season. Though, ultimately it ended up being bumped up after analyzing the 7 categories. So, it caused it to be tied for first or second here, despite me initially ranking it at fourth. For some reason, I wasn't expecting the season to make it this high when I was looking into the cast of each season, but it might have benefited by the others being a bit weaker. So, Melina offered absolutely nothing. Jay didn't get a chance to really do much during the short time they were there. Stephanie did have that fight in her last week and could have been more fiery had she not been blindsided early, and Tanisha really didn't stand out much at all during the season, so she was kind of a dud. Cal was definitely a train wreck during his last 2 weeks in the house, and it did bring some life into the pre-jury, though the first 2 weeks he really wasn't that notable either. So he was kind of interesting somewhat by accident, if that makes sense. Jess did have a very interesting run with being an outcast at first to getting into a decent enough position, only to blow up their game with winning HOH and picking random fights with people while just being very weird and off. Herman and Moose are both good casting choices, with the former trying and failing to be Derek, but it's just too messy and it's also just too unadaptable to really pull off anything. And Moose in general was a complete disaster gameplay wise, and always found himself in some drama, though he never really was that messy himself or that dramatic or volatile himself. Gino was pretty boring and didn't offer much to the season, though he did win a few competitions, but he could have been boring and unlikable slash insufferable, where he wasn't insufferable or unlikable, if that makes sense. Summer was a solid casting choice, and she did definitely had her moments, but she was inconsistent since she sometimes did too much, especially on the edit, and did too little at various points in the season as well. Marty was insufferable and entitled, but he definitely made his mark on the season. Jason Lin also is someone who was kind of boring throughout the season, though I think it was mainly due to her romance with Gino, but she got more interesting after he left as a player and a personality during her final week on the season. So I think she was brought down by her romance with Gino. Helena was under-edited throughout the season, but I do think she was a good casting choice, as she had her entertaining moments and thrived in the game. Betty was a huge win in the casting department, as she took everything so personally and was just so ridiculously funny to watch with how she just handled even the simplest things. I wouldn't call Josh a dud per se, but he was not one of the more interesting people on the season, as he was mainly just a normal guy. Kevin is definitely the huge casting win, or a huge casting win, as he definitely played the hell out of the game and enjoyed the hell out of it too, while also being captivating, self aware, and entertaining, which is rare. There are a lot of wins with the casting of the season, though there are definitely some duds that hold the cast back in comparison, which is why it isn't in the top two, but the duds in this season are nowhere near close to the duds on other seasons, if that makes sense. Before I started creating this list, I never really thought that this season would make it as number one regarding this category, though it really should have, and it makes a lot of sense now that I'm thinking about it. There was an 8% alliance that formed on the first week that was set to dominate the season. I don't really remember who is in it at the moment, and I don't even know if it was 8 people, but it was a very diverse alliance, and I think it involved Summer, Tanisha, Josh, Moose, Gino, Kyle, and some other people. Outsider Marty won HOH randomly, which ruined the majority's plan, and Jay was randomly booted there. Cal definitely decided to go all on out about the POC conspiracies. Remember, this was the very first season that took place after Big Brother 23, and Big Brother US is actually more watched in Canada than BB Canada, so the BB US house guest definitely knew about this. And he completely blew up the alliance and made a bunch of dumb choices, to the point where his other ally, Stephanie, was blindsided, and his best friend Gino sent him home the very next week on Gino's HOH. A duo named Kevin and Helena were waiting on the sidelines and in the shadows to make a move and to really direct the season, or to create the direction of the season to benefit them. And they had their shot when they saved Josh over. No, it wasn't Josh. I think it was Moose actually over Tanisha at the end of the pre-jury as they were nominated together, if I remember correctly, and recruited Josh to be in their trio while gathering a bunch of outsiders in a bunch of alliances where they did use it to run the rest of the season. We had Gummy Bear Gate, which decided who went home on Money's Fighting HOH, though I believe Kevin and Helena were already setting up Gina to go home within the last week up to that point already. And the very intense triple eviction where it was revealed how cutthroat and cold Josh really was to the jury. And he had to finally show his cards, which he had avoided all season up to this point. The final 5 round was very interesting, as Helena and Kevin was heavily considering booting Josh, and JC Lynn really fought hard to stay, which made it interesting. It seemed like Josh was really waking up, since he knew that Helena and Kevin were thinking about sending him. They almost sent him home, but he ended up screwing with the endgame as he booted Betty and taking Kevin to the end, causing Kevin to win. And even keeping Kevin over Helena wasn't the smart move. While Kevin was an easy to predict winner, he did not dominate the competitions, but a lot of social work and manipulation to create his own path and didn't get his way all the time. And there are so many other people who were playing the game hard here and had a lot of moments throughout the season to make their mark on the strategy element. We saw a mastermind game without the others being complete sheep who did nothing in the game, unlike other seasons that had a At this point, it's pretty hard to rank the drama in all 6 of these seasons, since I think the remaining 6 all have their good amount, so it's kind of splitting hairs at this point, in my opinion at least. I remember that they edited out the drama with Jay and Cal in the second week due to it involving race, and it was apparently a false claim, which is ironic due to the event of the following week. Cal did blow up his game due to race reasons, but I shockingly don't recall there being much drama regarding arguments about it, which was interesting and ironic, I guess. Jess got into a few arguments throughout the season, mainly with Moose and Herman during the short time that they, referring to Jess, was there, and I remember Betty arguing with Kevin, mainly with it being the both of them exchanging with one another. Oh, I also forgot that Betty argued with Moose as well earlier on in the season, and Moose kind of just had this like weird reaction where he's always getting yelled at and he doesn't really handle it the best, but he never really yells back, but he still finds a way to defend himself, if that makes sense. Marty caused a lot of drama and fighting with several people throughout the season, and it always kind of bothered me since he was so much older than everyone else, and it came off as more scary than anything else, since he came off as so aggressive, and the edits covering for him did not help his case either. The biggest example of this is his argument with Summer, where she really did nothing, but he was slamming things, yelling at the top of his lungs at her, and it just really made me uncomfortable, but he didn't have the energy for the people who actually did something to him. Things started getting more tame and boring when it came to the drama in the second half of the season, until the triple eviction, where Summer lays into Josh's ass for him supposedly turning on her, as she thought they had a closer relationship than he thought of her. And we have a great exchange between JC Lynn and Helena, as I think the former was still reeling over Gino's blindside and eviction. Things died down once again, but there were a lot of great moments of drama in the season. I just think the other 5 are more consistent in this regard, since there are several weeks throughout the latter portion of the season where there's literally no drama. When looking back at the season, there really isn't many twists in the season, and that's a huge positive, especially in this category. There was the secret door thing that was supposed to be this huge thing, but it never comes up again after the first eviction. There was the secret power of veto, where if the winner of the power, which was JC Lynn in this case, ended up telling anyone about it, they would be expelled from the house. And this is the week where I really wanted a twist to be used, which actually would have helped her and Gino's games, but she didn't use it to backdoor Marty, because Kevin and Helena convinced herself and Gino to not do it. Though this was under the guise of Gino doing it himself without them knowing about this secret veto. Of course, there is the triple eviction, but that's really not a shock at this point. But it's a pretty solid triple eviction with a lot of drama, and it's still listed as a twist on the wiki. So, yeah. The main twist of the season is the chain of safety, which was used in the double eviction. Moose won what would have been a normal HOH competition, but he had to start a chain of safety where a person is given the hat, which gives that person safety, and then they continue this process until there are 3 people left over, and in this case it was Jess, JC Lynn, and Gino who were the nominees. And what I really like about this is that it shows everyone's allegiances, and it shows everyone's cards, while making the double eviction a lot more interesting, since they don't just do the standard nominations, and it shows the people who were nominated that they're expendable to everyone in the house. Again, this season did not have many twists, which isn't really a twist, but the few twists that are in the season, for the most part, either improve things very positively or were a non-factor in the season. And the gameplay in this season and everything in this season happened very naturally, while the twist just sweetened or seasoned this season a lot more. I am struggling as to whether this should be second or first place, but I'm feeling like placing it here for now. The first week was a pretty standard week, though Jess did cause some drama with Moose, if I remember correctly, and there were a few fights otherwise, and the target was shifted once Jess won the veto that week, and Melina ends up going home. We move on to the next week where outsider Marty wins HOH, and it seems like he was potentially a target for most people entering that competition, and randomly targets Jay, who no one was really targeting, and there's no reason for it. There's definitely some unaired drama involving Jay, and Betty was starting to freak out as she had her fights with Kevin around here, but there's nothing really stand out about this week overall, though the 8 alliance that was set to dominate the season was about to crumble. Carol won HOH and decided to target Moose, who was someone he knew from real life, and nominated his ally from another alliance named Stephanie on the blog. They all start screaming at one another, which was pretty fun, and I think Betty argued with Moose here as well. And Moose ended up saving his life in the game by winning the veto. But Kyle doubled down on ruining his own alliance by trying to send Josh home, and this immediately bit him in the butt, as damn near everyone in the house told him to essentially screw off and blindsided Stephanie. While Gino winning HOH with most of the house against him seemed somewhat exciting, and him turning on Kyle was so random, it never really was an entertaining week, so it was kind of boring and uneventful, despite some of the most random events happening here. And the final week of the pre-jury was pretty interesting to me, since Jess won HOH, and right after being in a somewhat decent position after their rough beginning, they fuck it up with targeting Herman, who ended up winning the veto, and then sending Tanisha home, despite them being in an alliance. There was some drama in the week, and everyone was sick of Jess, who ended up going home in the double in a nice little bow. Wow, this is really hard, and I'm not sure if I feel very confident in placing this season at 6th in this category. We have the start of jury, where Marty initially nominates Betty and Josh due to the chaotic events of the double, but that speaks more towards the pre-jury than the jury portion. Herman is sent home at the end of the week in a pretty unceremonious manner, and the following week is also pretty boring, hence it being in the middle of this ranking. Gino wins HOH, and he wants to backdoor Marty, which is a great move for his game. But Kevin and Helena stop it. Jacelyn does not use the power that would have benefited herself and Gino, and it leads to Moose easily and boringly going home over summer. Ultimately, this portion of the season is bumped up by the final week, where we have Marty winning HOH, and he's insistent on getting Josh out, but is forced to nominate one of his allies due to Betty taking herself off the block. And after Gino is given the opportunity to back out of the gummy bear once someone in the alliance has to go up as replacement nominee, he ends up volunteering to be a part of it, which causes him to not only just be nominated, but he is also sent home here. And then we have the amazing triple, where Josh turned on both Summer and Betty, and Summer definitely reads into him before she leaves. So it's a pretty boring first 2 weeks, but it gets pretty interesting during the last week, hence it being. A part of me is shocked that the season is first in this category, but it really isn't shocking once you think things through. The endgame started off very well, as we had the triple eviction, where Josh turned on Summer and Betty in a pretty cold way, where he showed that he was with Kevin and Helena, and Summer's just laying into Josh. And while the eviction is happening, Jacelyn is still reeling over Gino's eviction, and she goes at it with Helena, which was just great to watch. After Summer and Marty go home, Betty wins HOH, which shocks people, and she nominates Josh and Jacelyn, where there was a lot of back and forth about who would go home, as Josh seemed to have woken up against the dominating duo, and Jacelyn kicks up her game a lot, but she still ends up going home. Despite all that, Josh goes back in the control of Kevin, and he essentially wins out throughout the season, but he ends up taking out Helena over Kevin, which is dumb, and he cut Betty in the finale, which was a huge blow. Kevin ends up winning over Josh, and there's definitely a lot of fun elements in the endgame, and it was pretty unpredictable. Or elements of it was unpredictable, and it was pretty cool to see Kevin win and control the season with only winning one cup. And like I just mentioned, first place is tied for second place, with both having a score of 2.86, and I'm placing BBCAN 5 as first, just due to me having more nostalgia for it, and me thinking that it's more iconic, and it's one that is more rewatchable in my opinion. And I also ranked it at second during my initial rewatch last year. So it being first here after going through everything makes sense, especially with all the above and the nostalgic iconic factor benefiting it more than BBCAN 10. So looking at the top four, it was pretty hard to choose which season to cut, but then one stood out a lot more to me, and it was this season that was the obvious outlier, and it's mainly due to the newbies. Mark is a pretty memorable first boot, but I don't know if he would have been interesting had he lasted longer. Emily made it halfway throughout the season and really didn't contribute anything to the season, and she herself was very boring and didn't offer anything as a game player either. Jackie was definitely a character, though a lot of her loner storyline just led to her whining and playing a victim, which got old. William and Dre had a great dynamic throughout the season and had some good moments, though Dre definitely brought a lot more in comparison to William. Dylan made it to the final five, and I really do not remember much about him, since he wasn't a villain, but wasn't a hero either, and wasn't interesting as a game player. Dimitri was arguably the only newbie who could keep up with the veterans, and while he is likable, I don't know how much of his contribution as a character and even a player was due to him on his own, or mainly his showman, if that makes sense. Karen is definitely reality TV gold, and is definitely the standout newbie in entertainment, though she really offered nothing in the game as a player. It's clear that the veterans were stronger than the newbies when it comes to the casting, though even some of them weren't that interesting this time around. Dallas had his fiery moments during the little time he was on the season, but it's also very easy to forget about him. Cassandra definitely had a fall from grace this season, but she was one of the few who seemed like she was having a good time, though she was definitely putting on a performance pertaining what she thought people liked from her in her last season. Gary seemed more mature this season, and I would have liked to see how he would have continued had he lasted longer. Neda definitely brought it in the season, though Neda became more villainous, mainly in the edit, though she really wasn't that different from her prior season, pertaining her actions. Cindy is a weird case of being a dud for most of the season, as she was literally the most invisible person for the first 5 weeks, to being part of the most memorable moment of the season, with sending Neda home. Bruno was nowhere near as notable as he was in BB Can 3, and Kevin really only came into large focus after Bruno was booted, since he had to win his way to the end. But some could say he was likable, while others could say he was irritating, as he suffered from the same issues as BB Can 3 with the bloated edit. Aika is easily the standout of the season, whether you like her or dislike her. She massively improved from her abysmal performance to becoming a great game player this season and really brought a lot of the chaos and intrigue into the season. While there are a lot of good and decent people from a casting standpoint, and the dynamics were mostly good, some of the faults that come from the newbies versus veterans dynamic holds this cast back, with a lot of the newbies being easily overshadowed by the veterans, and a lot of the veterans not being anywhere near as interesting the second time around. Though they're still a lot more consistent compared to the other seasons that I've already. It really isn't shocking that I have this season this high, pertaining its gameplay. Usually, veteran versus newbie seasons are very stale, pertaining to the dynamics of the season, which affects the gameplay, of course, but despite the veterans agreeing to work together, they were still going at it by the end of week 1. Cassandra ended up being on the outs with the veterans, Neda got close with Bruno, Kevin, and Cindy, Gary was on the out as well, and was ready to turn on Cassandra due to a lie. Dallas was too busy doing his own thing, and Aika was in the middle. Who would have thought that choosing between the muscular newbies and Mark and Dimitri would cause so much trouble and drama? Anyways, the six aligned of Damaika, Cindy, Bruno, Kevin, and Neda started to form in the second week, because Dimitri was HOH and had a lot of power throughout the pre-joy portion of the season. But everyone in their alliance was building allegiances with people that were not in their alliance, and they were building bonds with people on the other sides of the house. It was clear that Aika and Dimitri really wanted to work with the likes of Dre and William, and people like Neda, Bruno, and Kevin really wanted to work with the likes of Dylan, Emily, and Jackie. Of course, this led to the big alliance falling apart right when the jury portion of the season started in the double, and you had the rest of the veterans going at it for the rest of the season. What's very interesting to me is that all the newbies, but Dimitri, took advantage of the civil war, actually no, it was the outright war happening between the veterans, and had plans to boot all of them back to back to back to back. And it was going to work, though Dre got sloppy. I really like seeing the newbies take control of the game and to not let the vets steamroll them, which is something we rarely see in mixed seasons. Ika and Dimitri got themselves out of a few tight jams that are virtually impossible, and Kevin won his way out, which was honestly just kind of a boring way to end this season. There's so much interesting and intricate gameplay happening in the season, but Kevin kind of breaking the system with the competitions and how he studied for them is one of the reasons why I can't put it as high as the other two seasons in this category, where someone didn't have to comp out in the end. It was clear that there was a chance that this season would be the highest in this department, even before I really created it. But there was a lot more competition for this slot than I thought, which threatened this season's spot in the drama area. We start off the season with Dimitri being coached into getting into an argument with Dylan, which did start a feud between them that lasted for a majority of the season. And then we had the house fallout, which happened during the Mark versus Dimitri vote. This caused a permanent divide with the veterans, and we do see Dallas going after Dylan a few times, thinking that it would cause him to stay, though it did the exact opposite. Aika's flakiness really started showing, which caused herself and Netta to start going at it, though this wouldn't peak until a few weeks later. The Gary Booth week was definitely odd due to the twist that was put into place during the week, though we did see years of tension between him and Netta peak here as they took some shots at one another. Of course, the next week we really have the majority alliance falling apart, where Netta and Aika have several arguments throughout the season, which led up to the huge blow up in the double, which is arguably the series' most notable moment. Yes, I said series, not season. I do think things slowed down for a bit during the next week, but we do see Bruno and Kevin arguing with Jackie. Honestly, I completely forgot to mention all the arguments Jackie got into throughout the season, though hers with Ika definitely got very uncomfortable at times. And the feud that Karen had with Kevin picks up more around this point in the season. I think the next week is very dramatic, with Dre finally turning on the showmans, and then getting called out by Dylan and Karen of all people, and we have the ass that twerks moment. The showmans decided to be really petty with Kevin during the final 5 week, and while it did make things a bit more entertaining, the thing with this season is that the drama carried on from the very beginning of the season to essentially the very end of the season, with many of the drama in the season being talked about and referenced in other seasons after this, and it's still very remembered in the fanbase, which is why I feel like it deserves the #1 spot. Now that I'm really looking and getting into the season, there are not many twists in the season. I guess you could count the returnees as a twist, but based on how it played out here, with them not dominating the entire season, and the newbies not being complete fodder, it made for an interesting dynamic, which is not the case compared to most veteran and newbie mixed casts. It was half and half, there was some tension between the veterans, and the newbies can hold their own, so it was very good. The only other twist of the season that comes to mind, in my opinion, is Backwards Week, and it wasn't a good twist. It was where they did the nominations first, like the house guests nominating in the international versions, and of course, the house guests pre-planned something like this. Then the veto competition ceremony happened, and then the HOH competition happened, where the HOH ended up having the sole vote to evict. Ultimately, the person who would have went on a normal week ended up going, i.e. Gary, but the week would have been different if the same person won HOH on a normal week, i.e. Dimitri. The only other twist that happened in the season was the secret veto twist, where you had to find it, which William did, and he used it to save Kevin, which caused the latter to go on a winning streak, which he completed by winning the season. I guess at this point you could consider the triple eviction a twist, since it was the second time that they did it in the franchise, so it wasn't something that was consistent at the point, and the triple eviction in this season was very entertaining, especially with Dre's downfall and how it all played out over the course of 24 hours. Overall, the twists in the season were not bad, and either elevated the season or didn't deter at all, which is very rare for a Big Brother Canada season. But ultimately, it is not the best of the best, so it is at third, which is not a bad spot at all, and honestly, I was expecting it to be a bit lower before I really thought about it. I do think that all the pre-juries from this point onward are very good and strong, so it's pretty hard to choose between them. We have arguably the best first week ever in Big Brother Canada, where we had a split vote and the villains already going at one another, where the drama that happened in the week led to Mark going in a split vote. Dimitri went from the block to HOH within like half an hour, where he ended up being aligned with some of the people who literally voted him out hours earlier, and there's some drama with Dallas's downfall that was just pretty fun. The third week has Nada getting her revenge on Cassandra for trash talking her, and their new Persian princess fan favorite feud comes to an end here, though Jackie starts going off the rails here and starts her Black Widow arc and her just snapping at everyone. And the feud between Ika and Neda starts growing this week. The fourth week was very weird, since it had the events of a normal week done backwards, where the HH really had no power outside of being the sole vote, and the House made the nominees, so outsider Gary had no chance, though he had some fights with Neda before he left, as they've had years of issues going back to the sideshow during BBCAN 3. The final week of the pre-jury really had the main alliance blowing up as the Nekta versus Ika feud really starts to come to blows here, while Bruno and Kevin's position in the house weakened after they let Dylan and Emily stay on the block and left them to hang. In general, there was always something going on in each week of the pre-jury, but I just think that the others are a bit better and have some higher highs. And I don't even think I mentioned all the good stuff that was happening here. This is getting really hard, and I might switch it with the season that I have at number 3, or at least at the time I'm recording / typing this. Of course, it starts off brilliantly with a double eviction that happened with Neda's immunity running out, and it seeming like Cindy would make the easy move to boot Dylan. Nope! Ika asks simply to send Neda home, and Cindy is being spoken to about this by many people to not do the move, and she is so stuck on the move, despite her having ample opportunity to change it. And this ends up with Neda and Ika finally coming to blows, and Neda is sent home like 20 minutes after her immunity went out. The reason why this portion of the season is not higher on the list is because the next 2 weeks are very slow, if I were to be honest. Dylan winning and taking out Cindy, while good for his game, did nothing of interest regarding anything that actually happened, especially with Cindy whining about the predicament that she herself put herself into. And the next week had Dimitri taking the shot at Kevin and Bruno, with William saving Kevin with a secret veto, which would cause Kevin's run to the end of the season to take place. And while Karen lashing out at Kevin was kind of funny, this week was one of the more frustrating ones as well. What caused this portion to be higher is the week of the triple eviction, where we have Kevin nominating Ika and Dimitri, only for the Shermans to be able to finagle their way into staying over at Jackie, who really showed her butt this week, and then Dre's downfall over the last 24 hours of her game, with her trying and failing to flip, was a great sight to behold, and was definitely one of the better triple. This one was very tough, and I did consider putting it at the top of the list, pertaining to the endgame, but I just couldn't do it. This portion of the season starts off great, as the triple eviction was when Dre's game blew up, and seeing her react to it and call out Dylan while trying to do damage control was great TV, which brought some life into this late portion of the season. The final 5 was essentially Kevin versus Damika again, as he nominates them both for eviction again. Ika tells Dylan and Karen to send her home over Dimitri, and Karen ends up vetoing her after she cursed him off a few days prior and told him off at the ceremony seconds earlier, and ruining his room, because he was so sure that this would cause Dimitri to go home. But it didn't happen, as Karen was set on screwing Kevin, so bye-bye Dylan. Ultimately, nothing else in the season really mattered, since Kevin won all the remaining competitions, booted the showman, and was the first unanimous BBCAN winner against Karen. There was a lot of fun stuff within the endgame, but Kevin steamrolling through it competitions, or via competitions, just put it at second in this category. And that concludes my rewatch coverage of Big Brother Canada as a whole. It was a very long but very rewarding journey, as my opinions on the country, pretty much, are very fresh now. I went in deep regarding the gameplay of all of the casts, with the exception of 8, of course, and went into depth in the seasons, broke down each category, and was able to surmise not only this list, but the Big Brother Canada Game Player tier ranking list. You can watch all that coverage right above, and you can follow the journey via a playback if you really want to. So what I'm going to do next, because there are 24 seasons of Big Brother US, really, meaning there's 2.5 times more seasons than Canada, I'm going to start the process of ranking all of the elements of these Big Brother seasons early, so I'm going to start it pretty soon. So by the time BB26 ends, I'll be able to not only finish it, but I'll be able to have the time to go through all the seasons and compile all these category lists, which will take longer because there are a lot more seasons. I'm, of course, going to do my Total Drama Reboot 2024 Game Player Tier rankings and doing more Total Drama coverage. I'm eventually going to do some more compilation videos, and I'm going to talk about non-Big Brother and just random videos that discuss other stuff regarding identity, race, and yes, that reminds me, I am going to complete my Big Brother and sexuality series soon, and I'm thinking about covering some other reality shows sooner than later. So that's what I have in the works. Thank you all for supporting me. You can like, subscribe, check this description below for all other information, and I'll be back with something soon. Bye!